I'll first start with my name because the name also is useful for this whole broad theme around tradition, modernity, and all that, right? So my name is Haley Kalyan. So I was born when the Halley comet came in '86. That's when. So my father was a man of science at that time. So he gave me that name just so that it stands with Halley's comet. Edmund Halley, the scientist who is we attribute Halley comet to him. And then I am born in a traditional Brahmin household, and people felt it was just outside of the convention, it was too odd. So the name Kalyan is my maternal great grandfather's name. So that's how there is a modernity of Halley and there is also a tradition of Kalyan. So that's my name, really. Yeah. So yeah, I think I'll just elaborate more on what Deepa just mentioned in the introduction as to what brings me here really. So I like in terms of my background, I think you would have seen in the introduction, right? Like I am work in the IT industry. I have an MBA from IIM and BTech from IIIT Hyderabad. So nothing traditional about it really. I mean, it's all just the usual thing, right? So I work in the corporate, of course, but over the years, I think right from let's say from the time I did my MBA or just about that time, I've been reading up a lot on a lot of these questions that are plaguing a lot of us as well in terms of what is the role of tradition in our day-to-day life, what is the contemporaneity of tradition, what is the role of tradition in development discourse, what is the role of tradition in technology and innovation kind of discourse. So in the process, I've read several thinkers, met some of them, met people who have lived with those thinkers and all of that. So I started engaging more and more with my own tradition. And it is in that process that talk that Deepa mentioned also came from. I read this book by Puri Shankaracharya, and then I was quite like it was quite enlightening for me when I first read it, because usually we don't associate discourse on development, discourse on technology. We leave it to some economist or somebody sitting in some foreign university to talk about. For us, religion is more about bhakti, spirituality, and diksha, sadhana, that kind of thing. And we don't usually associate religious discourse with day-to-day like livelihood, whatever we do, right? So that was a bit of a awakening for me when I read that, and that's one of the reasons why I went ahead and spoke about it, because I thought it's a useful topic which it has a lot of contemporary relevance. And so I'd really like to focus today on that as a broad contour, which is Dharma, development and technology. And I'll try to talk based on my own readings and learnings. Obviously, I'm neither a Dharma guru nor I'm a pravachanakara or anything like that. I'm just a normal guy trying to like grapple with these questions. So I'm just trying to expose my own understanding here. So it is not like I am prescribing anything or I'm an expert or anything like that. So feel free to interrupt me at any point in time. And the more interactions and the more questions that come, I think that will really help this discourse, because these are like grand civilizational problems. So no answers will really come from these kind of discussions. It's more of more questions and more thinking and like setting the direction right and that sort of thing. So let me first, I think in terms of this whole discourse, right, I'll probably take an example of something I read or heard very recently. So I was looking at this talk by one of the traditional trained scholars on ecological aspects in Bhavishya Purana. So in there is the speaker who gave this particular lecture. It's on YouTube, so I can maybe share the link later. So he talks about how that particular Bhavishya Purana talks about various rules and prescriptions around how to build, let's say, if you have like a garden, what is the puja prada to be followed when building that garden, what are the rules and restrictions, so on. There's also this whole elaborate part there on cow grazing lands. So if there is a land and that there's a grazing land and that's left for the cows, how do you go about establishing that and then continuing that, so on. So in there are rules which say that this particular land needs to be used only for this purpose, not for anything else. If you violate this, it is equal to so and so pataka, or like in the traditional parlance, that's like a sin, right? So you should not do it, so on. So and that's something that I had seen in the past also in other Purana renditions and several such places. And if you look at the contemporary discourse, we have secularized that space and there is no limiting principle. So tradition had its own prescriptions and it said, do this, do this, do that, do that. And we have just taken away tradition from that equation now, and it is pretty much left without any constraint, right? Like if now I have to take this land and make this for grazing, my constraint really might be the diesel powering my JCB or something like that, right? I can just go on drilling and digging whatever I want. There is no limiting principle, and the only limiting principle otherwise is just the amount of money I can throw to buy land. So there is that whole schism that has come up, that there is a difference that has in that whole outlook where everything was considered sacred versus everything is being made secular, where sacred processes, it allowed for activity but also it put limits on activity. So it didn't say, let's say you have to create a cow grazing land. Your own tradition did not say don't do all that, this is give up everything, take a sannyasa, ascetic life. It's not like that, right? Tradition acknowledges that for day-to-day living you need consumption, production, all that. So there are boundaries established. And what we have done now is we have totally detached that discourse. Those boundaries are out, and we are pursuing a development model which doesn't have any sense of limits anywhere. So I think that's something that I see as something that is like constantly recurring whenever I get into these questions, that what exactly is those limiting principle in terms of how we conduct our day-to-day livelihood and economic activities and so on. And that's where, just to add the other piece that we wanted to talk about today, right? So this is a bit of dharma and development, kind of a contrast where tradition allowed for a certain level of development but also put limits, and the modern secular version doesn't seem to have any notion of limits, at least any limits that have an anchor in something sacred or transcendent. So if you look at technology question again, right? So one of the thinkers that the Deepa ji mentioned in her introduction was Professor A.K. Sharan, Awadh Kishore Sharan. So he is one of the best thinkers in these matters to come out of the Indian soil, let's say in the last century. He's not very well known because a lot of his discourse, one, is too complex for the common man to digest, and two, it goes too much against the status quo. So one point that he makes, which again on technology is very like foundational, is that he says that the traditional technology, which is, if you look at it as let's say the technology that we had before colonialism, that technology was rooted in cosmological principles. So it was not like we didn't have technology. You had metallurgy, you had various building, right? You had civil engineering, you had metallurgy, all of that. It was not like we were living a life where it was just like the a mythical early man picture we have, right? The two rocks, and then, so it was not like that. We did have our own sophistications, we did have our own building, we had our own sense of engineering and all that. But that technology was still rooted in cosmological principles, which means above it, there was still something which was controlling. Like this example from the Purana that I gave, that it allowed you to do something, but still there is something else on top of it which says, don't do this. If you do this, this will be the result. Now, with the modern epoch, post-colonial, post-enlightenment sort of an epoch, what really happened is that you have left technology without any cosmological principle on top. So the only principle that is limiting it is just very secular principle. So there is nothing that is stopping it, and there is nothing that is also telling it that this is the way that you need to proceed forward. So what A.K. Saranji says is that traditional technology was oriented towards optimum and not maximum. So optimum is more of sufficiency, right? Like what is best, what is ideal for this situation, and then put a limit. But the modern technology is oriented towards maximum. There is no limit per se there. So if you look at, let's say, a colonial way of looking at things, right? When they came to colonies, they didn't look at what will happen to this land if we keep doing this kind of thing. It was more like it is fine if it all goes away because it is anyway not us, or it is only there to exploit. So even if you look at the history of, let's say, how things happened in with Native Americans in North America and all, there was a lot of this whole bison massacre is well documented. That bison was a animal it's a part of the traditional ecosystem of the Native Americans, and then there's like a huge massacre that was done. Anybody rooted in a traditional sort of a grounding would never do those things, because the thing on consequences, the thing on limits, it constantly plays out. But because you are oriented towards maximum, it is more of how much can I extract from this land, that sort of a mindset. It is not about that sense of optimal is really not there. So I think that is again a difference between the traditional perspective on technology and the modern perspective on technology. This thing of optimal versus maximal. And similarly, when we talk about technology, right, there is also this thing of the moment you try to say anything critical about technology, you get branded that do you want us to go back to the caves? Are you trying to promote the village life? Village life is full of casteism. Or are you a Luddite? Or do you want to break technologies? How can you say like this when you are using a mic? You have a phone which has internet. So it's all these, it's a very superficial sort of an argument, right? And that's where I think there's a lot of thinking also in the West on these aspects. For example, there is a very famous thinker called Neil Postman. He isn't around anymore, but he did write a lot of books critiquing media, critiquing technology and all. So he makes a very poignant point that being anti-technology is like being anti-food. It doesn't make sense. Nobody can be anti-technology. Everybody needs technology to survive. But you still, when you're talking about food, right, you still care about what is good food, bad food, how was it produced, how much pesticides was put in it, is it good for my health, how much should I consume, if I eat too much I may get indigestion. They're all these, right? So technology is also like that. You need to, you need technology to survive, but you should also have this critical engagement with technology. So the moment you start criticizing, it is not that you don't want to use technology at all. It's just like being criticizing the way food is produced and consumed doesn't mean you want to starve. You are just saying I want to have the right quantity of food at the right points in time, so on. So I think that is again where there is a lot of merit with how the dharmic discourse works, that it doesn't talk about starvation or giving up. It is maybe there for the last stage of and for a particular sect like that. Like if you take the extreme versions of sannyasa, there are people who do that, where they give up everything, long days of fasting and all that. But that's not for the commoner. Commoners, even tradition acknowledge there is a grihastha ashram. That's the one that funds really everything else. So there is a strong focus on basic life, that you have a family, you need something for livelihood, and then you get something out of it. You produce, you consume, all of that. So that sense is there with tradition. It's not about starving. So again, going back to the earlier analogy, it's still about optimal. It's not about, so you have optimal, maximal, and then none, right? So it's not about that none sort of a situation. It is still talking about certain sense of sufficiency, certain sense of optimality around it. So just to give an example there, right? For example, so I was just reading, so in the morning when I was sitting here, I was reading this book by Professor Madhav Gadgil. He's a well-respected ecologist and environmentalist. He recently, I mean, his autobiography came out very recently. And he has done a lot of good work in terms of community knowledge systems, traditional knowledge, and how that balances ecological balance and all of that. So he talks about some examples, right? And it's something that most of us would know if you have some experience with day-to-day common living of, let's say, fishermen folk and things like that. So typically, any water bodies where fishing happens, there are always these holidays or around a particular tithi or around a particular festival where fishing doesn't happen. But the other times they consume. So they have this balance always that this is the time to hunt, this is not the time to hunt. And then Professor Gadgil talks about cases where once mechanized fishing and all those things came, right, that limiting principle is now lost because there's no limit for that. Similarly, like there are a lot of caste and community based restrictions also that he talks about, that let's say there are these 2 3 tribes around, and he uses this term called ecological niche, which is essentially saying this is your ecological boundary, this is my ecological boundary. So let's say you have a hill slope, there is a tribe on top or a jati on top, and there's a jati below. There is a, their own jati restrictions are there, which will say this is your work, this is my work, you don't come here, I don't go there, this is my resource, this is your resource, sort of thing. So there is that balance. Now of course today the whole thing around jati has negative connotations, because hereditary professions is not something that that's not something that people really like today. It feels like it's against individuality, right? So be that as it may, I mean, keep that aside, that's fine. And if you don't want the hereditary profession, nobody can anyway force it, right? That's in nobody's control. But if that model had a limiting sort of a condition which controlled this whole resource depletion, saying that this is my limit, this is your limit, and now you are saying I won't follow hereditary profession, which is fine, but whatever profession you follow, what is the limiting principle for that profession? and we don't have any of that today. So there is nothing called a limiting boundary for any profession. So if you take anything, let's say in a typical modern sort of an IT industry sort of thing, right? It's all greed is good model. So it is more about the more and more market that you can grab, the better sort of thing. So again, just to draw an example, right? So there is another anthropologist, well-respected traditional anthropologist called Professor Baidyanath Saraswati. He also wrote a lot of literature on pottery cultures and typical like traditional sort of lifestyles. So he again brings up this point in one of his analysis in a particular couple of jatis in a particular village where so let's say your specialization is X, let's say you are into a particular type of pottery work, and then somebody in your group says let's start doing this other thing. People from within your own group would stop you saying that if you do that, what about that guy's livelihood? You should think about that also. Let's not do that. They are anyway there. Let them do this work here. Let's not ruin their livelihood. Similarly, if somebody else from outside comes up and say, I want to take up pottery, again there is your whole village panchayat or those systems, right? There are these jati bodies which will try to resist that this is my work, this is your work, you stay in your boundaries, I stay in my boundaries sort of thing. So tradition did that to us, where despite all this inequity and all of this narrative, tradition also had that limiting principle. Now, if you take that out, today there is nothing that is stopping one from taking away the livelihood from another person. So, if you look at most of our modern day problems around poverty, around inequality, and all of this, fundamentally it stems from livelihood insecurity. So, nobody's livelihood is assured, and everybody has to fight it out. It becomes this dog eat dog sort of world, right? And in the traditional parlance, it's called the Matsya Nyaya, right? That the big fish eats small fish. So, and the whole idea of Dharma was to avoid that Machanaya world and construct a world where there is harmony and cooperation. Now, just because that we have demonized this one thing of a weaver's son becoming weaver is wrong, a barber's son becoming a barber is wrong, and a Brahmin's son becoming a Brahmin is wrong, just because of the darkness around hereditary succession, we are in this position where we are just saying there is nothing to learn from tradition. Just because one aspect of traditional living has been demonized for good or bad reasons, we are just stuck there that I'll now refuse to look back, I'll now refuse to look at tradition, and hence we are in this situation where anybody can take away anybody's livelihood without any accountability. So I can do like come up with new technology, or I can come up with some sort of a product which makes your livelihood redundant, and I have no obligation to do anything to you, because that's how the market runs. So I don't owe you anything, and it's all up to you. So it's more of you as an individual, you'll have to figure out what to do. So that's the kind of disconnect where the between the traditional discourse and with the modern discourse, where it is all very atomized, and the greed itself is celebrated as a virtue now, that there is no a boundary or a limiting principle for this whole process. And I think that's where we definitely need to engage a lot more with our tradition, because we need to understand that it is something that survived for thousands and thousands of years, and one definitely didn't have all of these ecological excesses. All evidence points out that it was we didn't have all of these ecological challenges then. That is one. Two, clearly there was no livelihood insecurity then, that you didn't have, let's say for example, student suicides, farmer suicides sort of a model. Then you look at all of our Puranas, all of our in not this just the so-called Shishta Puranas, which is the Ashtadasha Puranas, you look at Kula Puranas, you look at anything and everything, you will barely find instances of people committing suicide because their livelihood was lost, or people committing suicide because they are unable to, like a student suicide scenario we have today, right? The pressure is so intense that you have put so much pressure on the individual to figure out his own path, that individuals who are unable to take it are just committing suicide. And that these sort of instances you'll never find in tradition, because that problem didn't exist. Now, if the problem didn't exist because of let's say hereditary sort of an assurance, and that is taken away, we should still understand what else made it survive, right? Like this, why these things did not happen there, and why are they happening only now? So again, there it is important to look back and understand tradition. So I benefited a lot by understanding the traditional way of life, not just from as seen in let's say Puranas and Itihasas and all. There is also a lot of traditional discourse available on how all these jatis conducted their day-to-day lives, right? There's a lot of anthropological research, sociological research, all of that, where a lot of this is also documented. And we have, let's say, people like Guruji Ravindra Sharma from Adilabad, whom Udhbhavaha also considers as one of its inspirations, right? His whole work has been around trying to turn the gaze back, saying, let us understand the whole traditional society, let us understand those community equations, and then try to see what can be done from out of it, right? So this whole refusal to just engage with tradition because it is old, or because it is not like it was evil, or because it didn't allow us to grow. I think this whole thing that needs to be addressed. Without that, it is very difficult for us to really get better at anything we do, because we are constantly stuck that we are not tapping to what is there in our heads, and you are constantly trying to imitate from something else outside, right? Like people keep asking, right, what did India invent in the last uh, 50-60 years that you are using at home? Most of the things that you use are products from elsewhere, right? Because that whole technological thinking has stopped in our from our own like our own roots. Basically, it was not like we didn't have technology before, right? And we didn't have to rely on outsiders also. We were building our own technology. All of those metal instruments that people were using their day to day, they were all homegrown. You didn't have a company come and sell it, right? People were building it themselves. And everything that you are doing on, let's say, clothing, all of that, everything was native. But now you have a situation where all the know-how should definitely come from elsewhere. You are just like replicating that in terms of just the it's more like a manual is already given and you're just trying to build on top of it. If you look at, let's say, the way that we build our automobiles, right, for example, there is nothing uniquely Indian about that, except for some like bare minimum details perhaps, but most of it is still, it's pretty much the same as how it is anywhere else. So we stopped, I think, listening to our own traditional knowledge bases, and just ignore that as if it's not useful, it's not helpful at all. And I think that probably needs a lot of correction. One, from the ecological sort of a standpoint, and the other one also is in terms of this whole inequality, livelihood insecurity, stress, and all of these things, right? They're more psychological or negative. So ecological issues are something that you see in your face, but what is happening inside in the brains is, it's, I think it's much more damaging because of all of these whole processes. And I think that's where there is a lot of merit in engaging with traditional discourse on these matters. And so another aspect that I would like to draw some attention on to is also this thing on consumption, right? So we also have lost those limiting principles on consumption. So if you look at traditional discourse, you can count like quote many shlokas from Bharata, Bhagavatam, Gita, so on. Everywhere it is explicitly told that don't keep pampering your senses because there is no limit to that. So it's all about, there is this whole thing on Indriya Nigraha that constantly it keeps following you. Whatever you pick, any epic, any Purana, anything, there is always this thing that there is something more than this whole material pampering your senses sort of a model. And then you look at what we do today with our economic model, right? It is exclusively about pampering senses. Like if you look at advertising, for example, did advertising exist before? It never existed in this form, at least. So this whole thing of constantly trying to barrage you with buy this, buy that, buy this, buy that, never existed. So there is another thinker, just like Professor A.K. Saran, his predecessor of sorts, Ananda Kumaraswamy. He also has written a lot on traditional sort of a discourse. So there's one point he makes, which I think is very useful for this context, which is that, so he says this thing that Indian tradition or Indian society never had this thing of there is this American adage used called keeping up with the Joneses, which is you keep looking at your neighbor, right? Oh, they bought a car, we should also buy a car. Oh, they went abroad, we should also go abroad. The things like that. So that whole social ambition itself never existed in the Indian discourse, and it was never about looking at somebody and then consume more and more. And this whole thing of consuming for show off also never existed. So that whole thing around consumerism also is not something that we pay a lot of attention to, because by as we consume more and more, One, of course, is the ecological footprint and all that, but mentally itself, you're doing a lot of damage because you keep on measuring yourself only based on the consumption model, right? That there's no pause, there is no like a contemplative sort of a process there. It is just about you keep on consuming, right? Like there is no limiting principle to how many clothes you can buy. It's just the like amount of money that you can throw onto it, but you by yourself don't have a limiting principle that my wardrobe should be only this much, right? But if you look at again tradition, there are like very specific, I mean, across communities, right? So every community will have its own model there. So like I was reading something, for example, from one of my friends spent time in Kutch in Gujarat, and he bought some books from me from there of people who are doing a lot of groundwork with communities and all of that. So one of those books really talks about clothing that of people there, and there's a very elaborate arrangement of at this age you should wear this. This color is signifies this. So just by looking at the dress, you can actually tell a long story about that person, married or unmarried, or married and carrying, or married with kid. All of these things. This that whole thing is put together there. Now, one way to look at it is, so it's very strict and rigid and all that. But the other way to look at it is also how the tradition is kind of moderating what you should wear, what you should not wear, when you should wear, when you should not wear, all of that, right? So, same thing with, let's say, if you take a traditional Brahmin, Vedic priest sort of a person, right? Like people who are actually into Vedic Karmakanda and all. So for them also, there's a lot of restriction. Like I was speaking to one Vedic scholar who is like a well-respected person in the Vedic circles, well-trained, and has done a lot of yagna, yagam, all of that. So it's like very specifically tells me I am not supposed to wear that color veshti. I'm only supposed to wear this color. It is because of this. Today I'm supposed to do this. Today it's all, there's a lot of prescriptive moderating thing there, right? So depending on your role, you also what you consume and what you how much you consume is also policed a lot. Now what we are doing is we are saying that's all evil, that's all regressive, and anyway, like let's say if you take my case, right? I was born in a Brahmin household, but what I do has nothing to do with what a traditional Brahmin is expected to do, right? So I may look at all those rules and then say that it don't apply to me. I'll do whatever I want, and that's pretty much what is happening across communities now, because most people don't have that connect with what their ancestors did in terms of professions, right? And so the rules also don't seem like they are relevant, and it has become this 0 or 1 sort of thing. There's a binary there. But even today, if you listen to, let's say, I was listening to a talk by Sringeri Shankaracharya, and then he clearly says that if let's say this is 100, right? Tradition has given you 100 rules. If you can't aim for 100%, aim for 60, aim for 50, aim for 40, aim for 30. But don't come to me saying, tell me a way in which I can avoid all of this. Can you form new rules for new times and all of that, right? So there is this thing always that we expect new, that old tradition, I don't want it. Tell me something new. Because even if I tell you something new, it's not like you will follow it. It's just that you just want to hear something new. But if you look at this whole traditional discourse on consumption, it is constantly telling you that this is not the end goal. So you have shlokas which say that if you keep on pampering senses, it is like if you have this homam fire, right, and then you are pouring ghee into it, you keep pouring into it, it will keep increasing. So pampering senses is like that. And then on the opposite side, you have this whole advertising industry now, which is saying, I'll measure my product by the number of clicks that happen on the ads. So they are trying to build products which are trying to do exactly that. So there is no moderating principle for that sort of a universe. And we, like when we criticize, it is like, oh, but you guys are underdeveloped, you guys cannot achieve, that's why you are criticizing. You didn't build your own technology anyway, you are not rich. It gets into all of these things. But even in the West, there is criticism. There are a lot of people talking about, there is this whole thing on like advertisers are trying to manufacture desire when it's not needed. There is a book called Attention Merchants, which one well-respected scholar wrote, that a lot of these businesses, they are just trying to monetize your attention and all of that. And the business owners themselves, right? Some of these biggest Silicon Valley CEOs and all, there's a lot of, it was a lot of press was there some time back that they themselves were limiting the technology usage for their kids. So it is all very strange that in the West, they are trying to now figure out limiting principles in their own capacities. We have an entire like centuries old tradition, but we are refusing to look at it for any limiting principle of any sort, because we have this whole thing of like some sort of a hate and shame and guilt and all of that with anything traditional, and we just don't want to engage with it. When I say we, it's more at a societal level. I think at an individual level it still happens because you still have control in your own life, right? But at a policy level, at how laws are framed, as to how, let's say, your education curriculum is framed, there is very little of tradition in any of this, and that is where we still have this problem that limiting principle is lost. So fundamentally, I think tradition is useful in building that limiting principle to us, and that's where I think it's all the more important into the economic sphere, right? Like into your whatever today gets accounted in GDP, right? That's the sphere where tradition really has a game to play. What we are doing today is let that happen whichever way it happens, and we'll still do tradition in let's say in my own space. I'll have a good puja room at home. I'll go to this temple every week, or I'll go to this Tirtha Yatra once in a while. So we have limited tradition to the individual spaces, and where tradition actually mattered before, which is in how you produce, what you produce, how you consume, what you consume, that area we have left it to the markets, and the markets themselves don't have any sense of tradition. So that's a fundamental conundrum in this whole Dharma development technology sort of a discourse, that the whole idea of Dharma was to get into that zone. I mean, it is all about what you do, right, as a person. Today, what we are saying is 90 to 95% of my time is in the secular sphere. What I produce, what I consume, let it happen whichever way it is. This 5% of time, let me do Dharma. That's how it's pretty much things are operating, right? Because your whole economic model has no sense of Dharma, your education model has no sense of Dharma, your courts and legal constitutional machinery, that doesn't have any sense of Dharma. So we are living in a very it's like a bifurcated space where secular and sacred has been defined. Sacred is shrinking and shrinking, secular is expanding and expanding, and lot of us don't even understand that in this process we are also becoming atheists. A lot of this, what is traditionally called the nastika bhavana, right, that is what is coming more and more, because most of your time you are actually spending in that universe where there is no anything, like there's no sacred anchor anymore in that universe, and we are unable to first understand the entire expanse of our religion, that this was not a puja room religion. It was, I mean, I'm not demeaning that part, I'm just saying that it was not restricted to that particular, let's say, 15-minute puja you do in the morning. It was not about that. It was actually about the entire day and the entire your whole life, right? It was, there was no sacred and secular distinction in how Dharma operated in day to day. So even if, let's say, you are living in a like multi faith society, let's say traditionally if you didn't have Islam, Christianity and all that in your setup, and now let's say you have more and more of that, that still doesn't mean that the overarching discourse is still secular. So you should still operate in a discourse where the overarching discourse should still be dharmic, because the majority people of this country are still dharmic. So even though, let's say, you have these problems of, okay, yeah, I mean, hereditary profession, it has challenges, all right, acknowledged. Uh, then somebody will say women, patriarchy, all of that, okay, acknowledged. Whatever that is, you before you go there, right, you should not just have this picture that because of XYZ, I'll just abandon tradition. You need to consider first what is good in that, and then also debate all these things, that what is patriarchy, what is inequality, what is egalitarianism, all of those things, right? Unless you get into that, Dharma will never get into the development technology discourse, because it has been now brandished as like against egalitarianism, injustice, and like patriarchal and all of these various like pejorative terms, that it's pretty much out of the minds of a lot of young people. So if you pick somebody who has had just like a traditional I shouldn't say traditional, I should say maybe a traditional secular education, because if you just are following the state syllabus, right, whatever the government put in your curriculum, the chances are very, very low that you will come out with any sense of like pride or interest on your tradition. You'll mostly come out of with either ignorance or shame or guilt on your tradition, because that's how that whole thing is orchestrated, that this whole tradition doesn't even have a space in that, and somehow a lot of Hindus themselves have digested this whole secularism as a construct, that schools should have nothing to do with religion. It never was like that in all of our civilization till now, that education has nothing to do with religion. Education was all about, the whole purpose of Dharma was to teach, right? And it's about for you to teach so that you learn and then practice. So we have taken out Dharma from education as a curriculum sort of thing, right? That there it is out. And courts also it is out. Courts also we are saying courts should be secular. So that sphere is also out. Economy, we are saying economy, which is more about GDP, so we should get rich first. We'll get into Dharma later. So economy is also out. And then most of these avenues are gone, right? And then even these small solitary places that are there, let's say you have your own places of worship, that also is not with you. That also is secular, because again back to this thing, right, that your religion is evil, you cannot manage your temples, you need government to manage. So pretty much the whole thing is secular for us. That's why I think this whole dharmic discourse doesn't have any say today in development and in technological trajectory, because we have just limited, and in our own heads we have limited the dharma to one, to puja room, or to self-help, like I'll do my sadhana and I'll get better at what I am doing sort of thing. But societally it doesn't have much of a say. You do your sadhana, I'll do my sadhana, I can suggest you go to this guru or follow this sampradaya, it helped me sort of thing. But societal construct wise, it's all secular. I mean, we have just ceded that space, and I think that is it will continue to pinch us as long as we don't make constructive efforts to correct it. Particularly in terms of technology, I think it's going to get worse and worse, because so recently, like I think about a week ago, the place where I studied, Triple IT, it had its 25th, I think 25th anniversary, and we had some like luminaries from the technology spaces across the world come and speak. And one of my friends sent me a screenshots from one of the lectures there, and that talks about things like mining on the moon and stuff like that. So we had this whole Chandrayaan and all of that happen, right? We celebrated it because it was a cause of national pride. We could also do technology, and we are one of the few countries to go there, one of the first country to go there. It was a matter of national pride and celebration, all that. But if you then start wondering about the next leg of questions, right? Like there is a thing happening on moon for resources. There are already treaties and all of that. There's a lot of literature on that. That who owns the moon and who has those resources control and all of that, right? Now, if you start looking at those questions again, they'll fundamentally become dharmic questions. That mining moon, it just doesn't make sense, right, to a typical traditional mind. Now you need to get into those roots, like what is it that is prompting you to mine that moon? What are those causes? What is it that is so difficult here that unless you mine the moon, you cannot live life? So it again gets into those discourses, right? But if you don't get into those questions, it is going to happen. I mean, already it is happening, right? In so many countries, mining is indiscriminate. In our own country, mining is indiscriminate. In our own country, lot of these natural resources, they are like sand mining, for example, right? There's just, in fact, there are so many religious people who have given up their life protesting against sand mining, because this whole idea that Dharma has a role in development, we are just unable to like put our heads around it. And technology questions are going to come now. That, like the other day I was there is this technology magazine, I think it was Wired or something. It's one of these popular tech magazines. So they had published some series of articles which said next normal, which means what is going to be the next normal sort of thing. So they talk about technologies where, let's say, a person dies, and in 24 hours, once that person dies, you take like a man dies, and then you take that man's sperm and inject into that a woman or an artificial sort of insemination sort of thing, right? That they are advertising as a way in which, don't worry, even if your husband is dead, you can still get children from that person. So what does it even mean from a and you need to think of those consequences, right? That thought doesn't seem to come in from a secular sort of a discourse, because it is more of, it is possible, I'll do it, if people like it they'll buy it, if not it's fine. So there's more of, is this the right thing to do sort of a thinking doesn't seem to exist at all. So just to give another contemporary example, right? So the other day I stay in Hyderabad. So I saw this one article which said that a particular kind of invasive species of a fish started showing up more and more in Hyderabad waters. and then the analysis says that that fish was originally there only in the Godavari river, and then there was a river interlinking project that was done some time back, and from that river it came to this river, and from this river it came to this river, and now the waters here are fully invested with that invasive species. So these are kind of things that somebody who is doing it at that time should have the foresight, or at least some guardrails that okay, what might go wrong, sort of a thing, right? So we are not ready to engage with those questions at all, because you don't want to be perceived as anti-technology. So you don't even want to engage those questions, and that whole lack of thinking on consequences of technology is affecting everything else, because technology is not just about a particular way of doing things, right? It affects everything else. So again, just to quote the thinker's name I took, right, Neil Postman, he wrote a lot of literature critiquing technology in the West, and one of the points he makes is that technologies, the fundamental effect is really ecological. And when he says ecological, it is not like ecological in the sense of environment, it is of how it creates its own environment of its own. So the entire thing changes. Once the technology is introduced, the entire way of life changes. So we need a lot more thinking there in terms of what are the consequences, what are the guardrails, what should be the limits, what can go wrong with this technology and things like that, right? So if you look at, let's say, things like social media, about what 1 month ago there was this whole press that China is putting restrictions for children, that you should only browse so much, 1 hour per day, 30 minutes per day, that sort of thing. When they innovated on that, nobody thought of those consequences on what is it that it is going to do. It is only after all of this that this thing came up, and even that restriction is for kids alone, because adults can still do whatever they want, and because adults have the money, right, and they have to buy. So those are things where this whole thing on what technology is doing to us is, again, we seem to lack much of thinking in terms of what exactly are the consequences of this sort of an exposure to technology, and even like very basic questions, right? Like there is this thinker called Jerry Mander, who I think passed away recently, but he's done some very good work in the US on a lot of technology criticism. Some people don't like him because they feel he's like a Luddite, too anti-technology and all that. But he does make some sane points. So there is one book that he wrote called Four Arguments for the Elimination of Television. It was written when television was introduced, and this Jerry Mander is in the advertising industry. So he wrote more from that sort of a perspective. So one of the things he writes is that this is the first generation of humankind which is fully exposed to fluorescent lighting, and what are the impact of that nobody would know now, right? Because nighttime, you don't have a difference between day and night anymore, right? You are spending so much time in artificial lighting, and what is the impact of that artificial lighting on humankind is something nobody can predict, because unless you have like those long time frames, it is impossible to predict. But even to say this point that it perhaps might have negative consequences, that becomes like, again, you are anti-technology, anti-progress, anti-development, and that whole thing, right? So that's where I think there is a lot of struggle for us in terms of bringing in the traditional discourse, that the tradition does have a lot of say in a lot of these matters, but it is just not given that seat on the table. Basically, it's just assumed that it has no like a relevance sort of thing there. And you see this happen, let's say, even in aspects like food, for example, growing food and which crop is good for which cycle and all of those things, right? There's so much of traditional knowledge, but that is not useful for the market most of the times, because it also limits. So if you talk about eating an apple in a particular climate, right? Traditional discourse would have given you some other fruit that grows in that particular climate. But what we want is, I should be able to eat an apple at any point in time. But the traditional discourse would say this is not a fruit that belongs to this area, and this season is not right for this sort of food, eat this instead, or something like that. Just the fact that so again, you'll have to let go of some of your desires, right? So then at some point it is like, okay, this idea of trying to eat an apple in, let's say, Chennai is not a good idea. It's not a native fruit. Let me eat something that belongs there. But if you look at the way this whole modern discourse works, so for example, Bill Gates wrote this book on climate change and all that. In that, he actually celebrates this fact that anybody can eat anything anywhere at any point in time, and you can actually get it. Right? So he says, I'll try to work to enable that to everybody. So that's his idea of progress, that whoever wants at the end. If that means that, so if you then say that, oh, but why should I eat a fruit that has grown in Thailand? It has a cost. Then so that discourse is now turning into, oh, why do you say that only because it takes petrol to move from there to here? I'll invent something like I'll do electric, I'll do solar. Don't worry, it'll be green. So that sort of a thing. So in fact, Bill Gates in that book explicitly says that I don't see a problem of people like me using private jets as long as the fuel is green, right? Because that's the kind of thinking. But now just imagine if that progress narrative really happens, right? And then if 120 crore people start owning private jets, is there any thinking around that? No, because at some level they know this is only for rich, it's not for everybody. But if you look at the cars, for example, now, right now we are hitting that point. You go to every single city in India, it's just impossible. With this whole discourse of thinking that like buying and selling have no consequences is just hitting us even day to day. Like you cannot step out today in most cities, pedestrians cannot even cross the road. That's how bad things are. There are just so many vehicles and so much of traffic jams and all of that, right? So again, there is a limiting principle there that we have kind of forgotten. And if you again come to traditional discourse there, it will perhaps raise you these fundamental questions that why does everybody need to travel to this place for a tour? Why should everybody aspire to go to a foreign trip and all those things, right? That's why we don't like tradition, because it is trying to stop you from there. If you go to the traditional discourse, it says try and do this thing at like do this function at home, do this homam, do this vratam, do this japam and all those things, right? But they are not fancy enough now, and that's where it kind of you still wants to consume more, you want to do these activities, and again we are letting go of those limiting principles. So the whole letting go of limiting principles is where we are running into these challenges around ecological crisis, running into these challenges around resource problems, and all of these things. So I think we need to spend more time to first engage with tradition, to understand what is its role in all of these spheres of life. The more we separate these two, the more are we going to like suffer. I think that is one of the things that like I keep telling to myself when I engage with the thinkers like this and literature like this, that these are people who have been trying to say this for a long time now, but just that it runs counter to the broad development narrative, right? That is where it kind of doesn't get that room or a seat at the table. And I think we need to make conscious efforts when we are teaching to others, when we are learning on our own selves. We need to make sure that we are not consciously taking away tradition from a particular sphere, thinking that it's a secular sphere. You need to, for every act that you are doing, you need to think what was the traditional discourse around this particular act, right? Like even if you are, let's say, trying to uh, build a particular, let's say, this sort of a frame, right? And then you need wood for that. You should also have a sense of what is the wood that I should get for it, from where, so on. So even there, right? Like if you look at traditional discourse, for example, even inscriptional evidence, you have some of the kings. I think it was Shivaji's edicts, where it says if you are trying to, so Shivaji's army, right? It is they're very good at navy. For example, there's a lot of the naval army of Maratha Empire is quite popular. So they had this constant need to build more and more ships, and they wanted wood. So there are specific edicts from the king which says don't take the wood from a mango tree or jackfruit tree and this tree, so on, which says because this is for consuming, this wood is not for this purpose. So again, even that sort of, if you look at the Shasana as a source of tradition, even that has a limiting principle. Don't do this, don't do that sort of thing. And you have something similar again, where if you look at how Puranas go about that particular process of, let's say, if you are seeking wood for building a temple, again there are specific instructions given that if that particular tree has a nest on it, don't go there, don't try to cut that tree. If that tree has an ant hill, don't go there. So much of this, because there's a constant sense of, am I doing the right thing, am I doing the wrong thing, what is the limiting principle sort of thing. But if you look at what we have done in the name of development in a lot of places, post colonialism, post independent India, right, there's no limiting principle. We have just destroyed everything in those pockets, right? So we didn't think much on what are the consequences, and a lot of people don't even know that tradition actually has this discourse. They feel that tradition is only about praying to God, going to temple. They don't feel that tradition actually has a role in things like this. So even if you look at water management, for example, how day-to-day consumption water, right? There's so much of discourse in the traditional sort of sources, because people had to consume, right? There were step wells, there were lakes, there were ponds, community was building those things, there were community rules, community policing mechanisms, do this, do that, all of that. So somehow I think over time what seems to have happened is, wherever there is this, do that aspect of tradition, it is like prescriptive, it is against freedom, against liberty, all of that. So we have kind of taken it away, that if tradition says that, it is still okay, you can still go ahead and do, kind of thing, right? Because if you say on this particular day, don't consume this, that is what tradition says. Now somebody can ask, what will happen if I don't do? He'll say, that is a papa, I don't believe in all that. Just say that, right? There's no limiting principle there. I think that is what we seem to have done over time, that all the prescriptive things that we have in the traditional discourse, where explicitly it says do this, do that, we have figured out ways through law or through our own liberalism on how to escape that or how to ignore that. So over time, what seems to have happened is, it is like we are now not engaging with tradition at all. Like, how do we manage our forests? We don't use our tradition anymore, right? In the sense that communities may still use, but largely, right, as a forest policy, as how the government operates, as how the industry operates, how do you manage your forests? You don't have any traditional discourse. How do you manage your water? You don't have any traditional discourse. So anything that is to do with resources, we think it doesn't have a play. And anything that is to do with our own desires, also we think that doesn't have a play, because we think, oh, tradition limits desires, but I want to consume more, I want to do this. So that sort of a picture. I think that's where we need to understand the full expanse of tradition, that it is really about that whole thing of, from like the whole cradle to grave thing, right? You start and then you end and then you start all over again. So tradition really looked at that whole cycle of life and death all over again and again. So there is no notion of, okay, this part of my life let me leave, and the other part let me go ahead with it. So going back to one of these books by Puri Shankaracharya, right? And not just Puri Shankaracharya, I mean, although I'm using his name because in this context it is this book, but I myself have read and engaged with, let's say, Kanchi tradition, Sringeri tradition, and many other such traditions. These are all like on a continuum, it's pretty much what everybody says. So, Puri Shankaracharya talks about this thing of pravritti, nivritti, and nirvritti. That is the traditional way of looking at how you go about your day to day, right? So, pravritti means pretty much what you do outside, your day to day engagement with the world. And nivritti is the inward movement, which is the inside contemplative sort of a mode. And nirvritti is the moksha, like, or the mukti sort of a model. And then he talks that the whole idea of tradition is to have a shastra sammat pravritti, which takes you to nivritti and then from there to nirvritti. So shastra sammat pravritti really means, how do you conduct your life day to day, right? And there is a whole shastra discourse around what you should do day to day, and that slowly turns you to nivritti, which is the inner search sort of a thing. And all of this as a continuum together will take you to nirvritti, which is the moksha or mukti sort of thing. But what we are doing today is that pravritti, we are just totally left into the secular spaces, saying what I do as a livelihood, just tradition has no role to play. Let me just focus on the nivritti, which is my own inner contemplation. And if you are lucky and if you are some Ramana Maharshi level person, right, then you will get to nivritti. Otherwise, that's how things are, sort of thing. It's just left that way. But tradition never allowed for the whole pravritti space to become secular. The whole pravritti space was intensely sacred. It was intensely dharmic. And just because of these constraints, right, that as I said, just because you are not following your father's profession, and each one of us have to pursue their own profession, you have to figure out, like, you have to go through 18 years of education or whatever, and then you have to figure out your own thing, right? Just because of that one aspect, it doesn't mean all professions totally lose their sacred anchor. Ideally, what you could have still done, even let's say if hereditary profession as a model has limitations because of industrial technology, industrial revolution, and enlightenment values, like it's against liberty, equality, all that, right? Like why should a barber's son become a barber? He should go to US and maybe a professor, right? And whatever it is, or a chai wala can become a PM. We have all those things, right? That all of us like that rags to riches sort of a story. And there is this whole American dream version that anybody should be able to become anything so long as they work hard and like show the strength to get there. But that doesn't really mean that you take away all these rules on the professional spaces, right? So just because this entry point is not hereditary now, it doesn't mean that all of that rules and regulations that you had in the day-to-day conduct tote also goes away. What we seem to have done is this aspect of tradition, which is that hereditary succession, that one thing has been so demonized that that whole sphere of pravritti has been taken away from tradition now. So that I think needs to be contested, and that is why we need to study and understand more and more of how each of these traditional crafts and work streams operated, right? Like how did a weaver conduct his day-to-day life? How did a goldsmith conduct his day-to-day life? How did somebody who was working on metallurgy conduct his day-to-day life? And how was somebody doing like farming conducting day-to-day life? How was an artist doing their day-to-day life? We need to get more and more into that discourse in terms of how that whole livelihood operated, and then try to at least make an effort to formulate these new models of new parampara and all of that, right? So one, you are saying I won't follow hereditary profession because it is evil. Then you can also not say that I'll also not follow any tradition, right? You should at least cling on to something. So going back to the earlier analogy where I quoted Sringeri Shankaracharya's discourse, 100% compliance may not be possible, may not be desirable, but somewhere you should make an effort, right? That okay, I'll at least, I am at 10 today, I'll try to go to 15 tomorrow, sort of thing. But the total refusal to engage with that discourse at a overall uh, broad societal level, right? That is what is hurting us more. We are becoming more and more rootless, and more like stresses and problems. All of this is getting created. So yeah, I think that's really broadly what I wanted to touch. That let's not sacrifice this realm of pravritti to secular spaces. Let us focus that dharma is really all about livelihood, right? So in this space, in the Udhbhavaha space, right, you are in the school education, but just start thinking more and more about what will happen when these kids grow up, right? That's the space where dharma has really the play. I mean, education is all right, it's all good, but what you do with education, right? Like livelihood is where jivika really, that jivika is not dharmic, is where the fundamental problem is. And that is where we need more and more thinking and acting brains which are trained and grounded in tradition to take these things head on and formulate new models. Because the more and more we sacrifice our jivika model to secular or atheist sort of spaces, the more and more we'll hurt ourselves, and we may at some point maybe just left with some 2% 3% dharmic consciousness, because rest of it all we have just said that this is not a dharmic realm, this is a secular realm. That cannot happen. I mean, it won't help us, it won't help our future generations, and fundamentally it's not the right thing to do. So yeah, that's what I wanted to just broadly cover today. Yeah. I think anybody has any questions or you want to expand more, we can talk.
Namaste, I'm Deepak. I'm Deepak from Bangalore.
Mhm.
I fully agree with whatever you had to say. Uh, in the last few years, I've observed. I mean, I watch a lot of YouTube videos and I engage mainly with content similar to what you're talking.
Mhm.
My sense is that the tide has turned. People are realizing more and more the drawbacks of so-called modern life,
Right.
this exposure to super capitalism, and so on. So, isn't it time to sort of, ride this wave?
Right.
Uh, there are so many groups now talking along this similar theme. Uh, isn't it time to more vigorously get together? There's no one taking the lead, but I mean, I just wanted to put it out there that and so who would be the best person to lead such a change? I would say it's someone who's scientifically, who's trained in scientific method,
Mhm.
who's also conversant with our Indian traditions, not only the text but also having live with people on the ground who practice our traditions and get the best practices together.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that the Westerners are very good at doing is making a textbook,
Correct.
systematizing education, and then popularizing things. To some extent, I think the Japanese do this very well. For example, there's the book Ikigai, which
Mm-hmm.
became famous. It's become a pop sort of, it's again popularity throughout the world. Isn't it time that some of these Indian principles are also popularized? That's something I just wanted to put out. Uh, one earlier observation on your point of when the whites, the Westerners went to the Americas,
Mm-hmm.
the bisons were exterminated. Native populations were exterminated.
Right.
However, that's an extermination to that extent. In fact, there was very little extermination here on the Indian subcontinent. My sense is that to some extent the colonizers realized the beauty of our civilization, that there are beautiful elements and there are very powerful beautiful elements, and that would have protected us, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think I mean this thought is, and of course they are not going to admit it, they are not going to admit it's a civilizational thing, there's this clash of civilization sort
Right.
of, they will never they will try to establish the superiority of their civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and they're not going to admit it. But if you look at it, there's no species that was hunted to extermination here.
Mm-hmm.
The tiger, because of shikars, they were depleted, but I don't think there were species that were entirely eliminated. Populations that were exterminated by the sword. Disease would have eliminated, famines would have eliminated population. Uh, but so there, I think the British saw the beauty of our and there are writings which allude to this.
Mm-hmm.
That they considered the beauty of our civilization, and so they, while they economically exploited us,
Right.
uh, they did not destroy the civilization in its entirety. That's what. Would you agree to
Sure.
that?
So I think there are two questions, right? I'll
Yes.
probably first talk about the first
Yeah.
one, right? So I agree definitely that now there is a bit of a resurgence, that there is indeed that wave. I mean, so many people are sitting here. I met the team of Udhbhavaha in a workshop, and they called me back in. So somewhere in all our minds collectively, right, there is this thing that something is amiss and this is not the way.
Yeah.
So that wave is definitely there. But I think one thing that, like from my understanding of Hindu Dharma, is one thing that, like conceptually we seem to resist is centralization and like one sort of a book, one sort of a manual sort of thing, right? Like even if you like I was talking to the team in the morning, there, even if you talk about an acharya parampara, you cannot talk about one acharya. There is dvaita, there is vishuddhaita, there is all of these variants, right? And then so many different acharyas are there, so many different sampradayas are there. So I don't know if that sort of a consolidation really will work for us. But what would definitely work for us is to, as I said, right, get an understanding of how tradition operated in all these spaces before, and then try to like get more and more of your own local, your regional, your community, all of those things, right? I think that is where there'll be a lot more of help in terms of what is local to this land, right? Like for example, like to take a more practical example, right? If you look at this whole landslide, all of that was happening in Uttarakhand and Himachal. The other day, I think about a week ago, there was an article which published saying, it said that it is probably about time that Himachal starts looking at traditional architecture, because there's no point building this whole multi-story building in that sort of a hill terrain, right? Like I went to Shimla about a few months ago, and I felt so bad going there as a tourist. I felt I should not have possibly gone there, because there's just no limit at all to what they have built there. I was standing at a point and I feel that the whole thing will fall over me. There's just so many buildings, and they're building a tunnel also. So there is just like there's just no thinking at all that probably what worked in a plain area like Bangalore, where I built a 40 floor building, I should perhaps not do it there. That sort of a thinking itself doesn't seem to exist. So I think those are areas where definitely we need to get into what was my traditional building technique, what was the material that was used, what was the architecture that was there. So even there were like 2-3 floor buildings that were built because of those terrains and situations, right? So those I think is where we need to definitely tap, like local knowledge systems, how are things run before, that sort of thing.
Just on that point, the issue is that when we talk about traditional Indian science or technology, there's suddenly someone who makes this pronouncement that in the Mahabharata they possess nuclear technology and airplanes were there
Yeah,
back
yeah,
then, and that plays a role in what do you call it? People talking in a derogatory manner about traditional science, whereas what
yeah,
is actually scientific,
yeah.
and there's a lot of beautiful science. I've read Dharampal ji's
Correct, correct.
books,
Yeah,
uh, and plus, even if you were to, I've, I've been studying the Gita under a competent guru, so I know that there's a lot of beautiful science that needs to be highlighted, and that I think can be done by someone who's both scientifically trained and knows how to properly frame the.
yeah, yeah. So I think that's where there's a lot of work to be done in education, definitely, both at a school level and also one level up in higher education. That this whole thing of history of Indian science and technology, that is a subject, and thankfully in the past few years, I think there's a lot of it picking up. So Dharampalji was not so well known, let's say 20 years ago. So I met Dharampalji when he was there on campus when I was in IIIT. I think maybe 2 or 3 more people from my batch would have just met him because he was not popular. Nobody even knew that whole discourse, right? But today, if in the same campus, if he were alive and he were to show up, right, I'm sure more will go, because I think that has spread, that this whole thing that we do have some sort of our own thing that has spread. So there is definitely a lot of work that is to be done in the education space on that. That what was our own traditional thinking on science, our own traditional thinking on technology, and how did things operate. That is very important. And at the same time, it is also important to critique this whole thing of like nuclear weapons and airfare and all that, because even a traditionalist interpretation of those subjects, right, they don't say that like this whole Vimana Shastra did not exist, but they do say that there was no civil aviation. Like people did not, there was no airport, there was no cab to go to the airport, and people, like I came from Hyderabad to Bangalore in a flight, right? That model never existed. Even the most hardcore, let's say to use that word, even the most hardcore Hindutva supremacist would never say that there was civil aviation in that time. They may say that that technology, that is more of, okay, we also had that sort of a thing. But then there is again a nuance there, right? Like you mentioned, Dharampal, he writes about plastic surgery happening in pockets of India at that time, and it carrying forward. So that is one thing, but that need not just be extrapolated and then say that this exact plastic surgery was what was done to Ganesha at that time in that era, right? We need not try to mix these two. And at the same time, you need not dismiss the Ganesha's origin story as unreal, because the pramana for that is not science. The pramana for that is whatever is there in your Veda, Shastra, Purana, that narrative. So for that aspect, that is the pramana, and you need not. So what happening? Like one of the reasons why this thing happened also is because your God, your stories are all false, your stories are all myths and all of that, right? That whole discourse, just to prove they are right, we are now taking this discourse that actually that was science and we were scientific. But I think we can separate these two, that the evidence for us being scientific needs to come from discourses of the kind that, let's say, Dharampal had. And then also, I mean, if you take like Ayurveda and all, that's a much more longer continuum, right? So you can draw discourse from there, but we need not, I think, like mix these sort of two things. But definitely there's like tremendous amount of work to be done on this whole history of Indian science and technology, because even things that are like purely factual, right, that mathematics and all, there is evidence even till 16th century of the work that has been done. But because of this whole politicking around it, the moment you say that, it's been like, oh, are you from BJP, are you from RSS, are you from WhatsApp University, this whole thing happens. I think that has to be definitely thwarted. So that, I think, work is to be done, but I don't know if like one individual or one organization can do it. I think it is up to everybody in the education space to start picking up these strands, and even for parents and for individuals also to start uh, like reading and engaging more with that sort of content, because I think that definitely needs to be done. Yeah. And then the second question, I think the second one you had was on.
Yeah, I mean, it was an extension of the same thing.
Huh.
Yeah, it was.
I just
Yeah.
wanted to, and one is talking about what right now you're putting it across, but for an ordinary person, it's so important how does an ordinary mind works.
Right.
So, just put across in these two words the difference between starvation and upvasa. These two things are two different things.
Right.
How you look at it does matter.
Right.
In one sense, probably starvation mostly never was part of.
Correct.
But upvasa was part
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah.
But upvasa was never considered as starvation
Correct.
in that sense. If you
Yeah.
look at
Yeah.
it. So where did this come from? It not necessarily that somebody told us. It's the whole practice, the way we lived was such close to the reality which it automatically was part of it.
Right.
So when you were talking about Grihastha I think it's all about that.
Correct.
Like there were gurus who attained so much of this thing, and they used to practice in their limit, in
Correct.
those spaces. But I still feel, and Pejar Swami is talking about in something, when he walked out of the matha and being part of the samaja, the whole guidelines and things changes.
Right.
It could be looked very differently also.
Right.
But the person like him has the awareness of the context and the purpose in which he's walked out of that, and being in a samaja when he's sitting in a Dalit colony and eating with them, has a different view or context to it.
Right.
If you generalize it and look at it, it looks very different.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, hearing with Pavanji or Ravi Sharma, since we were talking about it also, I think he somewhere he says ये देश तो विधान से चलने वाला देश है, संविधान से नहीं, ऐसा.
Correct. Yeah.
This word is so important to me also personally. When I'm saying this, it is not that we're taking away these rules which have its place.
Yeah.
Beyond it, there is something else.
Correct.
Like in a joint family of 5 brothers, how the property was divided. Maybe there was also called Jest Bag, where the elder son would have got the first portion apart from all the rest, and then it was divided equally. Why? Look at it, I'm not talking about the extra portion, I'm talking about the thought process behind it, the design existed.
Right.
It is not more about the rights, but on the responsibility side it was more.
Right.
Today, when we are talking in the modern context, more about my right.
Correct.
Not really looking before the right, have I fulfilled my responsibilities.
Yeah.
If my responsibility is the first step, then probably rights is always taken care of.
Correct.
So I think there is some thought process in which we've been living. I might not know where is it coming from right now, but it's already part of
Yeah, it's a part of your like upbringing, memory, and your own karmic sort of
Absolutely,
thing,
absolutely.
right? Yeah.
And most important for me, anything what we choose to do or not to do, whether it's tradition, modern, whatever the words that we are trying to use. I think for me, most important thing that I would look at it is the impact of it.
Mhm.
What is the impact of my choice of doing it or not doing it on myself, on my family, and the larger part into the samaj.
Mhm.
I think somewhere I also heard any new invention before it was brought into the samaj, probably at least 4-5 people would have really thought about it.
Correct.
There could be a dharmic person, a spiritual person, a samajik person. There are various kinds of people who would say what would be the impact. Basically, I think the discussion was on the impact, how it leads. If the impact is only on me, probably I'll be the person who would want to see whether I need to go ahead or not.
Right.
But if the impact is large, probably I need to reflect on little more outside the periphery of my individual reasons why I would want to walk or not.
Right.
I think the context also needs to be understood. It's not that when we say tradition, it's not necessarily Indian in a geographical sense.
Yeah, correct.
There's a lot of other traditions outside this geographical sense which is also talks about the same.
Yeah, they may be similar also.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So why is it similar? Because it's the impact that it is drawing.
Right.
It could be in South America or it could be in African continent, anywhere else in the world.
Correct.
So it's not just the limitations of the geography, but it is the context of the impact is what for me most draws my attention to.
Right. Yeah.
Even today, whatever the cause that we are taking, whether it is with our children, with ourselves, like technology was saying,
Yeah.
the limiting part is so beautiful.
Right.
But since I'm involved in farming, the divinity part, when you say the traditional part, when we just recently, a month back, we just sow paddy in our field, and traditionally, those ordinary people on that particular day, when we get into the paddy part, they will not have bath that day. Because the thought was that when you go to temple, you will not come back home and you have a bath, because all that has come to you, it will go away. So they still practice that, and you come back, and children used to ask me, why do we don't have a, so otherwise it's just a physical matter, no?
Correct.
You put your sapling there, the paddy will come and you will still eat.
Yeah.
And as you said, there is something beyond the cosmic part. I
Correct.
think the connection is where we are trying to draw our attention to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how one can draw is, I think, by being part into such practices.
Yeah, I think that's where, like, just to add to what you also mentioned, right? The fact that a lot of our own things were not exterminated. Thankfully, we still have some percentage of living memory still alive on so many of these aspects. So that's what we need to tap into. What is unique about our situation is what you mentioned about this responsibility versus right thing, right? Previously, that responsibility, we were already born into a parampara sampradaya, you didn't have this challenge. But today, you have to first go to school and then figure out your Swadharma, right? So Swadharma, the definition of Swadharma today is what Steve Jobs said of follow your passion. That is how it has become, right? Because there is nobody telling you what your Swadharma is otherwise. I mean, there is no parampara you are born into. That whole line is destroyed in largely more or less destroyed. Wherever it is alive also, the urge is first to get out of it and become something else. Only if like nothing else works, or if there is enough money, like it's a family business which is running well, then people may take to it. Otherwise, this you have to figure out your own, right? So that is a very broken model, and it's a very unique situation. None of our ancestors had to be in this model where they had to go figure out your own Swadharma. Was like it was a oxymoron in that sense, that it never made any sense. But that's where we are today, that each one of us has this honors to figure out our own Swadharma, because the paramparas are destroyed, and it is a unique situation. We'll have to respond to it in terms of how we construct these sadharna samanya dharma sort of model, right? At least those we have to construct that. But even there are challenges, right? So even if you look at a traditional samanya dharma narrative, even that will say unlimited greed is not good, but your entire stock market runs on greed only. What will you do? So those problems are there, that even if you take out varna ashrama dharma, samanya dharma itself is so much anti to what is running outside. So like one of these traditional gurus, right? We have Puri Shankaracharya's guru is Karpatri ji. He wrote a good book on Marxism and Ramaraja, comparing this whole Western sort of science and Western thinking and Indian model. So traditionally, we have always seen as capitalism, opposite is socialism, right? And capitalism, communism. That is the binary we have been told in the modern era. But he actually argues for this thing, which he says is a Dharma Niyantrit Punjivad. Punjivad is capitalism. Dharma Niyantrit is Dharma moderating capitalism, because he says that is how our tradition was. Everybody was a capitalist in that sense, right? Because everybody was essentially a small business owner. So we were not this communist country where state owned everything and everybody was going to a factory. Every home was a factory, and every that individual was essentially the entrepreneur of sorts, right? Although he had a group, he has a community and all that. So we were a dharma niyantrit capitalist country in that sense. But what we have today is a model of capitalism that totally desists, or it is totally against that, because it doesn't like acknowledge that realm at all, right? So like going back to that lunar mining sort of a mindset, this whole thing that if you want resources, I'll go to the moon. If Earth is done, I'll go to the moon. If not, I'll go to Mars. And this is not you and me saying, right? It's the highest, like the people who you are celebrating today as icons, like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. They are the ones who are saying these things. Jeff Bezos says we should probably take all the factories to Mars. Factories will run in Mars, people will stay in Earth. This seems like a sustainable model. He's actually said this in a proper global forum. And there are people who are talking about mining the moon I mean, they are building instruments, they are building those plans to go there and do all this, right? I mean, that sort of thinking itself seems, it's a very strange thinking, because essentially you are saying that just because our population grew 4x or 5x, whatever, I have to mine the moon. None of my ancestors had to mine the moon, but I alone have to mine the moon because my standard of living is more, and that it just doesn't sound right. I think that's where this whole thing has to, I mean, Dharma has to get into that zone. Otherwise, it's going to get very difficult to address that. And just going back to your point right earlier, that why didn't the uh, colonial, that extermination of the sort, that didn't happen. I think one is, of course, that there are just too many of us. The density wise, right? If you look at it, our landmass it just has too much density compared to an Australia or Canada or US. And then the other one, it is again a point that Professor A.K. Sharan also makes in his works, that it is not easy to destroy Hinduism, right? That there is no pope, there is no church. So if you look at how the whole communist conflict happened in Russia, they took over church properties and they persecuted the priests and nuns and all that, and that sort of limited them there. But here there is no church, right? There is no pope, and that whole structure is itself very different, right? And there is no temple also. So if you destroy one temple, I'll be worshipping this tree, or I'll be doing some Gayatri Japam at home. What is there for you to destroy there, right? Or like you said, I am doing upvas, which itself is a sacred act. What will you destroy? I mean, that is what. So it's a very difficult construct to destroy. That is why I think Hinduism or Hindu culture itself could not be exterminated the same way that Native American tradition or indigenous American tradition got destroyed. But what got destroyed is, I think it's all in the like that whole colonized consciousness sort of thing, right? In our heads, we have been trained now that tradition is bad, tradition is backward, that's all superstition. There is, I mean, this whole belief in God is all anti-progress. We should earn more money. We should first develop and then we can think of religion. This whole thinking, I think that is all is the gift of the colonial sort of state.
That was the result of deliberate educational policy.
Correct. And
Political and educational.
that's where I think it's like people, like I was speaking to one of my friends the other day, and then this the fact that education influence actions is something that is so hard for people to get. It's like, oh yeah, in school it's fine whether you go to this school or that school, how does it matter? But I think that's again, there's a lot of effort that is needed there to explain why the colonial education policy was the way it is, because they fundamentally figured out that education changes behavior, and they invested fully there, right? So sometimes people draw this equivalence that India has been colonized for 1,000 years, because they try to say Islam colonization and British colonization. The English colonization is very different because of how education got like taken over, right? Like we didn't have this experience before where our entire like minds got rewired. So this process of where our thinking and our children's thinking, that whole thing is changing. That is very unique to the, I think, the colonial sort of a system.
So when I say the tide is turning, what I actually mean is that decolonization is accelerating. That is my sense.
Yeah, it is. I mean, at least, I mean, it's becoming popular. But I think if you want to really get serious about decolonization, you will have to get to people like Ravinder Sharma, Dharampalji. That's the level, because that's where the action actually happens.
Yes.
Otherwise, it is more of I mean, like doing this rename or things like that, right? They're more at very, I mean, they have their impact, of course, but you cannot stop there. And if you want to actually get into what was actually done in the colonial system to us, you'll have to get down to people like like Ravinder Sharmaji, Dharampalji, and that is where I think you'll have to first acknowledge this thing that I am ready to give up my like hate, guilt, and shame about my past. I'll keep it out. First, tell me the whole thing, then I'll judge again. Because today, I think we are not even ready to get there at a policy level. If you look at all the recent discourse, right, so like eradicate Sanatan Dharma, some politician says something, someone else says something. It is all of Hinduism is bad, Hinduism is anti-equality, Hinduism is anti-justice, and all that. So if you want to decolonize, we'll also have to fight all those battles. I think only then you are at least ready to listen, right? Otherwise, today I know people who have, let's say, met Ravinder Sharma ji, and then still ignored the discourse because they are from the leftist activist sort of a mindset, and they said that's all still taking us back to villages sort of thing, right? Because I think that we have to break those walls. Unless we do that, I don't think much will come out of the decolonization discourse. Because if you are not, so fundamental question is this, right? That if you are not what the colonizer said who you are, then what are you? If you want to understand what are you will have to talk to Dharampalji, the Ravinder Sharmaji, A.K. Saran, these sort of people, because they are the ones who are saying you should go back to your tradition to understand who you are. But if you say tradition is bad, tradition is evil, then you are saying colonizer is evil, tradition is evil. Where will you go? You can't have both ways, right? You'll have to at least engage with one thing with a like a sense of faith and respect. So yeah, I think that definitely needs to be done. Yeah. Please.
I'm Pavitra.
Mhm.
Just on a lighter note, I'm telling, I don't know the depths of it. I'm just getting
Sure.
exposed to the topic only now. Yeah, this thinking was there, but my question is, had this, should this have happened for us to realize that the tradition of ours was much more evolved compared to what they're trying to do right now, the Westerners? Because sometimes what we have with us, we don't appreciate it until and unless it goes somewhere else and it takes a different turn and then comes back to us. Because probably are we fed up of what we had, or didn't we see the light in what we had, the knowledge, and it had to come from again West for us to realize that, oh, this is the thing that we have to look
Right.
into before we inculcate in our lives,
Right.
something like that. And the other part is the in when we were kids, we were told not to watch the eclipse
Mm-hmm.
because your eyesight will be gone. That is superficial. They would tell something bad would happen to you, something, and during eclipse you should not eat food. Um, your digestion, these things, and even your body will not accept things like that. And a few years ago, renowned authors in Karnataka, they started eating when the eclipse was going on. And what kind of an example they are setting? A tradition says this, but somebody who we see as, okay, they are like really good thinkers, they start doing this. We are confused there.
Right.
And there may not be a immediate impact. If somebody dies when they are eating while eclipse is going on, nobody would do that.
Right.
But the impact is long term.
Right.
And we are not really trained to see all the long term impacts.
Correct.
Immediately, what is there? I'm hungry, I want to eat food.
Yeah.
That kind of impact we are trained to. But these things in tradition it was there. And when you speak about rules are there to break. I think at that
Correct.
one point of time, I think
Yeah.
in our teenage, rules are there to break. If somebody says this, we should never do it.
Right.
That kind of a mentality. Till when do we carry that kind of mentality? Rules are there to break. When do we stop and sit and think that these rules are made? For what reason is it made? For who's good, or for what is the basis of these rules? And who are the ones who made it?
Right.
Those kind of thinking, when does it come in us? Like naturally does it come?
Correct. Yeah.
Or should it be like schooled or things like that?
Yeah, so I think like two questions, right? The first one which you said was where you were saying that to understand the value and richness of our tradition, should it go there and then come back here, sort of thing, right? I think that happens in pockets, like I think Ayurveda and all that are good examples, right? Where somebody does some research there and says this particular food is actually good, and then we realize, hey, that was in my diet every day, I used it in upma yesterday, sort of thing, right? That happens. But then the other part is also that because we in that whole thing has been it has been colored black, right? It's been told it is bad, it is evil, don't even look there. Sometimes you don't even know that you are actually, when you are consuming this whole western discourse, you're actually taking something for tradition you may not even know. Like this happens a lot in this whole yoga, meditation, self-help, this whole school, right? So there was a friend of mine who used to talk about these things, that it's like something new that was that somebody gave a name and all that. Then you look at day-to-day puja rituals, you are doing the same thing here also. So I think sometimes you don't even know. So that is one part where I think you don't know, and then of course only with the external validation you are getting it. That I think it will take time, because you need to this whole mindset of that I am inferior, or I was not rich, I was bad, that is why I got conquered, or my tradition was evil, that is why the Britishers took over, or we had a caste system, that is why our people converted. There are all these narratives, right? Because of which over time I think we feel that we are an inferior people. So I think that thing, unless that goes, it will take time. I guess it's a long journey, but at least acknowledging that is important to for us to understand that. And then the next part is of course on the rules. So I think so funnily, right? I mean, we think of it that way, that traditional rules, they need to be broken. But if you look at your day to day, there are so many of these nonsense rules that you follow, because if you don't follow, you'll go to jail, or if you, those kind of things, right? Like, I mean, there's a lot of people who protest on this sort of beef bans and all that, right? People say, why is your tradition saying I should not eat beef? I'll eat it right before you. Because breaking tradition is allowed, but if you try to eat peacock meat, you'll go to jail, because that's a protected animal, you're not supposed to eat. Wildlife Protection Act, right? So there are those things that rule you'll follow. There you won't take chances. If you try to like hunt a crocodile and eat, right? Immediately some forest department guy will come, and because that's again like you have all these things, right? And you are on the road, driving right, driving left, stopping at the light. So many things you blindly follow. If you have like a car registration, bike registration, it will expire after 15 years. Why 15? Why not 10? Why not 25? Why not 30? Nobody asks, right? You just go blindly. Passport is up for renewal 10 years. Stand in the queue. Is that thing like I was there for some land registration thing, old land that was sold in a place where I was some 15-20 years ago. There was a power cut. We just stayed there for 3-4 hours and then came back. I cannot even protest because the revenue officer, land officer, everybody knows how those things work, right? You, in common man, doesn't have any voice there. But if you go to a temple and then something happens, there's a power cut or some queue thing happens, you'll feel like, oh, this temple is being mismanaged. This is not good. That is not good. What is the government doing? What is this pujari doing? We have this thing, the tradition. We somehow have this. Okay, that is there for my wish and will. But all these regular system, day-to-day laws and rules, you just blindly follow. It is not like you are free there, right? I mean, you are like, even on matters like education curriculum and all, you only have so much choice. You have to basically teach whatever they ask you to teach, right? Though all those rules you blindly follow, but somehow when it comes to the religious realm is where you'll feel like everything is up for grabs, right? That you can contest this, you can contest that, all sort of thing. Somehow I think it boils down to some sort of a lack of Shraddha and all those things, that somebody, let's say, like you were speaking about an upvasa and all those things, right? People who are already doing those sort of upvasa on an Ekadasi and all that, they really won't mind if you say today is an eclipse, do that also, right? And they are already doing it, they know no big deal, so they'll just go ahead and do it. It is only this mindset that I want to show that one-upmanship sort of thing with tradition, right? That I'll try to break it and then I'll prove that even if I break it, nothing has happened to me, sort of thing. I think it's a very strange attitude, because we seem to think if I break tradition, I am free. But outside, you are doing everything that what the market is demanding and all of those things, right? There's nothing called free there. If everybody is forced to buy a car, everybody is forced to buy a bike which runs on petrol or electric, whatever, right? What is so much of choice there? Just that you have choice across 4 brands, but you have to buy anyway. Everybody is using a phone, everybody has to connect to the internet. What is so free about it, right? That there you are not questioning anything, you are just surrendering to how things are. But here you just ask so many questions. I think that whole thing of outside I am liberal is not true, because so much of you are following so many rules there actually, just that the rules are dictated by laws and not by customs. If you break custom, nobody will put you in jail. If you break law, they'll put you in jail. That's the only difference, really. And this schism didn't exist before, because law and custom was the same. It was all only dharma. So there was no this thing of achara is you can break achara but just follow what the Raja says. That model never existed, because what is dharma and what is achara, it's all the same thing. Like shastrachara and sadachara, lokachara, it was all the same thing. Now we have this thing that laws are different and customs are different. So customs are there to break and laws are there to follow. That thing never was there before. That's a very new thing. Like, I think it's only after the colonial this thing that laws are to be followed, customs are to be broken, sort of a model that came up only now. It didn't exist before. But in general, that attitude is also coming from atheism, scientific thinking, religion is anti-science, all that, right? That also, I think, it's a long game. It's very difficult, because you are dealing with your education, your parents' education, and your grandparents' education, all three being in a secular atheist mode. That situation was never there in the past, where 3 generations came out of atheist education. We are dealing with that today. So it's not going to be easy to transform in like our own lifetimes also. We should be very clear that it's like a long battle. So we'll just have to keep moving in the right direction, one step at a time. But no, like this is going to be there. Like yesterday, night I saw a movie because my wife was saying after kid we stopped watching movies. So I said, okay, we'll go and watch a movie. That movie, it's a Telugu movie called Kushi. It is about this where I think the heroines, the actress father is a pravachanakara, the hero's father is an atheist. So in fact, in the movie, the conflict point is this only, that guy says, I'll go, the atheist father, he says, my entire family will sit on a flyover and then eat when the eclipse comes. So in this atheist thing is there. I mean, that's a strong strand in our discourse today that is there. I mean, if it has made to a mainstream movie, you can understand how much popular that whole discourse is, right? But I think we'll have to struggle with it. But it all comes down to, I mean, in a democratic setup, it all comes down to majority, right? So, and majority is not even 95%. 35% is enough to become chief minister, prime minister, right? Because most people don't even vote. So, even on these things, if you are 40-50% dharmic, it is enough. The other half the people won't vote, and the atheists maybe just 10-15%. So, they'll anyway be there all the time. This 40-50% should be the ones who are actually batting for dharma. That's what that number has to keep growing more and more. But they are not going to go away. I mean, that atheist discourse, traditionally also you have a Charvaka discourse that starts this way, that so if you look at this whole Darshana discourse, right, there is a book called Sarva Darshana Sangraha, which is a standard philosophy discourse which talks about all the darshanas that we have. Chapter 1 is Charvaka, and in Charvaka you have all these things, that why are you, so if you are doing this ancestral rite where you make these rice balls and keep for your ancestors, right? So the Charvaka discourse is that if you are putting a rice ball here and your ancestor from somewhere is coming and eating, next time when you go to some other city, I'll eat here and you need not have lunch because I ate, whatever I ate will go to you, those sort of things, right? Or you give me food in the ground floor, I'll eat it from the top floor, because you are doing the same thing with your ancestral ritual. You are saying, I'll give food somebody. So this whole thing, this is chapter 1, and there are 16 chapters of darshanas after that. Every single darshana will first refute the one before. So that, I mean, tradition acknowledges that Charvaka discourse exists, that will not go away. So only our problem today is that is becoming mainstream, and the actual dharmic discourse is lesser and lesser, because your whole education discourse is essentially a Charvaka discourse. Because secularism, if you look at the writings of people like A.K. Saran, he's written a lot of good work on the origins of secularism, and he concludes that because secularism is not anchored in the transcendent, it is a form of atheism essentially, and our whole education is secular, right? So you keep on giving only secular education, you are going to get atheists only out. So there's no doubt on that will keep increasing. I think we should just have that strength and belief that things will change over time, but it's not going to go away. It will always be there.
In order to improve the uptake, the rapid uptake of the positive aspects of Dharma, to what extent is it important to address the persisting evil of untouchability? To what extent can this phenomenon of Dalits, untouchability, and the continuing practice, to what extent can it be attributed to Hindu Dharma? I am not well read enough
Attributed to?
Hindu Dharma. I am not well read enough to gauge that. And what more can we do to eradicate untouchability? And I'll tell you why I'm asking this question. We had the Stalin controversy and the Sanatan Dharma. In my first, there was the emotional response was that of a bit of a revolt. So there was a revolting sort of a thing. And then I thought maybe in South India at least these practices are eradicated. But the very next day in the news, there was this news from Tamil Nadu, from a village, that in a government school, because they hired a Dalit cook, and the parents didn't want the children to eat the meal prepared out of that, they withdrew the students en masse from the school. And then there was the IAS officer had to come, he had to explain Prevention of Atrocities Act to them and things of like that. Naturally, when we talk of improving the uptake of dharmic principles, because of the association of Hindus and Buddhists, there's bound to be an impediment. That it's not just that the impediment has to be removed. This practice has to be completely eradicated. On the see, constitutionally it is outlawed. There is a we have a very strong affirmative action reservation system which is monitored by the Supreme Court, but it's not eradicated still at the ground level. So these are some of the things. I mean, it's related to.
Yeah, it is. I think, see, broadly, anytime anybody talks about tradition in a Hindu context, with any sort of like a positive tone or the fact that you are trying to recommend that tradition is the way forward, you will have to answer at least 15 questions. Yeah, you'll have to answer at least like 15 questions. What about Sati? What about temple entry? What about Devadasi? What about untouchability? This is going to be there because that is how our discourse has been built. So just to contrast, right, and I'll probably answer that specific question also. But the way I look at it is that somehow Hindus uniquely have to, when they introduce their religion, right, they'll have to first answer these 15 questions. But no other religion talks about their negatives or like supposed negatives. They don't talk about that at all. So if you talk to a person from some other religion, right, they typically talk about their tradition, what it stands for, their gods, their worships, and all that. But Hindus alone are uniquely in this position where the moment you talk about anything Hindu, you'll have to first answer all these 15,000 reform questions. And we ourselves also are unique in the sense that if you look at how our political parties or even Hindu institutions put their uh, promotion material, right? There's always so many sets of reformers there, at least like 10, 15 reformers. If you ask me to name 5 Christian reformers, I actually don't know. And I know there is some Lutheran revolution, something, but I actually don't know. Or if you ask me to name 10 Muslim reformers, I don't know. And it is not like those religions don't have flaws, but somehow I think Hinduism alone, we have a lot of these reform guilt that we have to bear in the contemporary times. So we have that unique challenge. Now, coming to untouchability specifically, I think there has been a lot of traditional discourse also on that topic, and the way I understand it is that I won't deny that like that as a concept doesn't exist in the sense that there is indeed a lot of traditional discourse on what is touch, like what like this shaucha sort of thing is always there. So even if you ignore the whole caste discourse and keep it out, even at your own home, what to touch, when to touch, whom to touch, there are 15 rules. When somebody dies, there is something that happens. There is a period where you don't go to temples, where you don't go to the puja room. So this whole thing on touch and not touching, there is a lot of discourse. That there is no doubt on that, it exists. And across castes, this problem is there, and this problem is also much more acute now because in the past, those communities were all like they were on their own, right? Everybody had like their own, to use the term I used earlier, what Professor Madhav Gadgil used, of their own ecological niche, in the sense that each one of them had their own resources. So even if you look at something like Parashara Smriti, for example, which is a Dharma Shastra text, there is a talk about wells which are owned by X caste, wells which are owned by Y caste. So, but then it does acknowledge that each caste has its own well, in the sense that let's say if you were to use a contemporary analogy, right? I am in a gated community, you are in a gated community. You have your water supply, I have my water supply. You have your park, I have my park. So long as both of us have the resources, this whole fight of I cannot come to your community, or your security did not allow me into my community, or your park is bigger than mine, these don't emerge. Because resource inequality is there. Everybody is not same. But then everybody had their own resources, so it was running. But once this whole resource, like let's say my water supply is cut, but your water supply is still there, and then I come to your place and I am denied, it definitely becomes injustice because now I don't have a means to survive, right? So if you look at a lot of these current day untouchable communities, they actually had a lot many more resources before, and they were actually their own ecosystems of sorts. Even if you look at traditional community, like there's a Madiga community in the Telugu places. I don't know the word for in Kannada, but these are the leather related castes. And today those castes are really oppressed because their whole thing and that entire livelihood was destroyed. But if you look at their documented evidence, and documented evidence of history written by their own people, not even written by some Indologist or written by a Brahmin scholar, right? It clearly says that they were quite rich. They had full control on leather. They used to make so many leather instruments, and they had their own 5 to 6 different artist jatis, which were their own genealogists, historians, and all that. So I think at some level differences did exist, but they were self-sufficient communities. It was not like just because you call me an untouchable, my world stops. And more often than not, you are actually dependent on me because I am supplying every single leather instrument to your village. That whether you call me untouchable or not, you will have to engage with me because I have that resource strength, right? But what happened after the colonial epoch is I am deprived. My whole thing is destroyed, but you are not because you figured out a way. I mean, you for whatever reason you got a white collar job or you got a government job and all that, right? So that whole thing, livelihood thing, got upset. So I think a lot of animosity today on untouchability comes from that livelihood upset sort of a model. But whether Hinduism can really get to a stage where untouchability in the sense of any touch anytime is okay happens, I'm not sure, because as I said, in the same household people are following untouchability, right? Because there's a whole ritual purity aspect to it, and I don't know how that will go away. Like if somebody is doing a puja there, you won't go and touch him, no, because that thing is there. Or somebody is in some sort of a vrata or that sort of a thing, or in a diksha, they are treated differently. So I think that problem will remain. That I don't see how it will go away. Or and in general also, it is not like there is touchability everywhere, right? Like I don't touch you. It's out of respect, right? I mean, there's no point in doing that act. Just because I didn't touch you, you cannot accuse me of being discriminatory, right? And that is a maryada basically. So this whole thing on touchability also, I think we just extend it to like too much, that it's not like everybody is in the business of touching everybody all the time, right? I mean, that is there. But the community, I mean, the caste discriminatory aspects do exist more so in the colonial epoch, because the resource deprivation happened in the after the colonial epoch. But inequality in the sense of I won't touch you, I think that always existed before. Particularly different, I think, in the context of Hinduism from a Shastra standpoint, also is this thing that, like I quote from the work of Pullela Sriram Chandradu, who is a Mahamahopadhyaya and a trained scholar in the Telugu space, Telugu Sanskrit sort of space. So he also says that if you look at this idea of Asprushyata, there were also exemptions from that, in the sense that a king could outlaw untouchability. So a king could say that from today onwards in my land, this caste is not untouchable anymore. That authority did exist with the king. And there is also this discourse that if you are going to a pilgrimage, or if there is a fire in the village, or if there is a fair or jatara happening in the village, this doesn't matter. And this is something that somebody like Dharampalji also I mean, that statement of Dharampalji is very famous in one of his books on, I think it was the Bharatiya Chitta Manaskala, this one, where he goes through a train journey, and then he meets a lot of people who came from a village, and they're like packing their own food and, unpacking their own food, and they start eating in the train. So he starts talking to them. He asks them, so which caste is each one of you from? And they respond saying, when we go on a yatra, there is no caste, there is no jati. So you also have that. So in the traditional parlance, the jati, I mean, this whole asprushyata is also not looked at as an absolute, in the sense that, like if I'm talking about a phone, right? The phone is always a phone. It cannot become a camel, right? Because that is the nature of that. But asprushyata is not like that, because I am saying that it is context sensitive. If there is a event happening, then you are exempted. That means it is a conditional, right? It's not the like the innate character of it. So if there is a ball lying there, I cannot call it a tiger. It is a ball all the time. There is no other possibility that it's always a ball. But this whole thing on touch is not like that. There is always this sense of like what touch, when touch, and all of that. Like this whole asaucha notion, for example, it's only for those 10 days when a death happened in the family that your touch is bad, you are not supposed to go to a temple. After that, it is still okay. And the same thing is there for, let's say, when there is a menstruation event that happens for a woman, right? Those 3 days is when this discourse is there that you should not pray, you should not maybe go to a temple, all of that. Now, of course, I mean, nobody is going to stop you there and check, right? People still defy and go, that's up to them. But that's still context sensitive. So it is only for that period that it is saying that this asaucha exists for you. It is not saying it is always there for you. So to that extent, I think there is a context around it. It's not like context neutral, and it is not like a permanent thing. There is always a way to exempt. And for the communities that were specifically tagged as untouchable, as I said, they had their own ecosystem also. So we should also acknowledge that fact, that it was not like they were deprived of livelihood, they were deprived of their own spaces, their own art forms, and all of that. Everything was like self-contained on its own. So that also existed. Our disruption right now, like the cases that you mentioned, right, where a particular school, this whole event happened, that is really happening because it's a new predicament where people from multiple different backgrounds are put in one place, and each one of us doesn't have anything to cling on to. So lot of people are really left with the emptiness of these achara vyavahara. They don't have their resource bases, they don't have their ecological niches, they don't have their livelihoods. So it is only these ancestral like memory thinks of, oh, but I'm not supposed to eat with this guy, why am I eating? This is all that is left. Otherwise the traditional things are not there, right? So I think we should also acknowledge all that, that we are living actually in a very painful sort of a situation where a lot of these ancestral connections are cut off. We are deprived of our own bases and traditional upbringings, and that is where this thing is happening. But even if you like take this all of it aside, as I said, I don't think this whole perfect equality also exists. So many rules are there, so many exclusions are there, and so many people cannot get into so many spaces, right? And like they'll say, if you try to go to a pub also, that guy will say, if you don't wear shoes, don't come. You have to wear. So I have this experience of going to a club in Madras, one of these old British era clubs. Somebody from my one of my previous organizations took me there, and they said you cannot come with a collarless T-shirt. So that keeps happening, right? It's not like there are equal spaces. I'm not saying I'm trying to compare that experience with what you said, but I'm just saying that this perfect equality of anybody can do anything everywhere, that also doesn't exist. We have so many rules and so many exclusions, right? I mean, if you are from some certain countries, you won't even get a visa to go to another country. The US has a list of some 6 7 countries where they say if you belong to this country, don't do business, don't get these. All of these things are there. When the Ukraine war happened, for example, they said, oh, people from these countries, don't deal with them, no business. So I think these things keep happening. This perfect equality also is not there. So I think we need to like identify that balance. Yeah. But it's a difficult area. We have to. I mean, it exists. We'll have to deal with it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, few observations. Sorry, can I get a micro? Yeah, namaste. Hello. Yeah, namaste. So, a few observations for all the different things we've been talking about. I think if you look at pre-Abrahamic societies, even places where today they are Christian countries, I think you can find parallels to dharmic thought. When you read the letter of Chief Seattle, written to President Truman, it's there. Because these were people who sat in the nature and observed what's happening outside me, what's happening inside me. They saw a connection, right? And then when they realized the magnitude of what's happening, they were actually filled with wonder and overwhelmed. And with that feeling of overwhelming came from realizing how beautiful and how amazing this creation is. And the reaction was, I'll bow down to this. And later on, the Abrahamic religions came and said this is pagan worship and all that. Because their thinking comes from their books.
Right.
And where Daisy Suzuki once remarked, and Joseph Campbell quotes this, that it's a very strange religion. A man against God, God against man, man against nature, nature against man, nature against God, God against nature. So all these three are in continuous conflict. So if they come across a patch of wood, their idea is let's cut everything and use it. So their whole idea comes from how is it useful to me?
Correct.
When they interact with anything. So they don't see themselves as part of it.
Correct.
So I would say this thinking came from there.
And then when they started colonizing the whole world, they just took, so once that thinking arose, that thinking shows up in their science, that thinking shows up in their literature, it shows up in their clothing, it shows up in their architecture, it shows up in their way of living. So when they colonized the world, they exported all of that. So now we are realizing suddenly that we are not living our life, we are living their life. But we are also reacting only at the surface because now, oh, West versus East. But nobody is talking about what is the root of their thinking. Where does that thinking come from? And then when somebody said there's a wave happening here, yeah, but again it is not, it's again at the surface because 99% of the Hindus, you have to explain what is Dharma, nobody can explain. But the day you understand what it is, it's a light bulb. Because then you see how far away it is from religion. Right? And if the kids and just everybody can, focus on, let's talk from that. Even if you have Dvaita, Advaita, Vishishta, Advaita, but still Dharma doesn't change. The Ruta doesn't change. It is still based on the same thing. The Sampradaya changes in terms of the way you're going to now set up your whole system in order to achieve the moksha. So that everything goes there. But the fundamentals don't change. So we don't need to have a centralized textbook, but the concepts we can definitely make sure that that is understood. Because that gives strength. Because when somebody quotes Dharmo Rakshati Rakshitaha, there's a totally different understanding of that. But when you understand Dharma, the understanding is different. Because when you understand Dharma, you'll realize that it is something, like you said, it's something that you want to do. It is not something as a concept you keep in a shelf. Okay. But I lived in US for 15 years, and there I saw there's a clear dichotomy between what you say and what you do. And it is normal. Right. It is the way you are. And nobody blinks an eyelid. And it doesn't even cause any conflict inside. So Sunday is reserved for church, and even there, you can go there, dress up. You can go for various reasons, but as long as you're going to church, you are a good Christian. Right. And then you come and you do your chemistry and you study other things. There has been no connection between what you say and what you do. Correct. Anyway, you can go and confess over the weekend, and you'll be all set. Right. So here, if it creates an actual problem for us. Right. What we are saying and what we are doing is not aligned. It really messes up in a big way. So I think first thing is that Dharma part of it. Untouchability, I think what I saw was actually it was there in Europe in a way. Yes. The serfs, there were people who had to live on the outskirts of the city. They were not even allowed. Yeah, I mean, like you said, a lot of pre-industrial societies, they have similar formulation. You'll find it in Japan, you'll find it in France. In fact, there are books also written on this topic, just that nobody talks about it because it upsets the narrative. Yeah. But it's there everywhere. I mean, most pre-industrial societies had it. I think in our case, the only difference is because, as you said, it is everything you do is so fully baked into the religion. A lot of things are also carried to the post-industrial world, and we are still grappling with how to go about all those things. So that's the struggle. But here the sparsha thing, I think it came from, untouchable came from, what are those people who are supposed to be untouchables, what are they touching? Yeah, yeah. They are touching, if they're touching meat, if they're touching other things, we don't want to touch that. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a mix of like professional related obligations, right? I mean, a lot of cases, people who are working with skinning dead animals across continents, those roles had these taboos. Undertakers or people who worked in the graveyards, they also had these taboos. So I think those were there. But we also had these other like cases, right, where you are put into that because as a punishment because of some other transgression you did. So I think those are also there. It's a mix, but in general, I think a lot of societies had it. Just that we speak, as I said, we are somehow exclusively supposed to be bad and guilty. So we are supposed to talk about it all the time. Even things like manual scavenging, for example, right? Even to this day, people shame based on that. But that also was so much of there in the Europe, right? We didn't even have that as a jati, so to say, before the colonial era. We didn't even have that as a jati. It is only after they came that it actually became a jati. And even to this day, like
traditional terms, you won't even find it in so many societies because that act itself didn't exist in the traditional society. But somehow, even though a practice exists in so many different places, we alone are uniquely in that whole guilt, shame, and hate sort of a mode, and that needs to be combated. I think that's more of that colonial sort of a impact, that all these things that have existed elsewhere also, we alone are supposed to just like bear the guilt. So just to like, I'll just give one example, right, just to add on to that. So one other thing that gets a lot of abuse on our side is your priests are hereditary, like Brahmins are hereditary castes, or even non-Brahmin priestly classes are also hereditary in most cases. Sampradayas, where temples, right, where non-Brahmins are priests, that's also hereditary. And so the other day I was reading about some of the traditions in the Ukraine Orthodoxy sort of churches, right? So in Christianity there is a mainstream Catholic Vatican sort of a church line, Pope and all that. You also have this Orthodoxy which is called Eastern Orthodoxy, Russian, usually Russia, Ukraine and those places, they have their own tradition. So there in Ukraine there is one particular class of priests where they could marry. Usually a typical Christian priest cannot marry, right? That's why you have a pope structure and then that whole ordainment process and all that. And they have to practice celibacy also, that you cannot indulge in sexual acts.
Bishop can marry.
Yeah, but usually, I mean, that's the thing, right? There's a celibacy thing, monks thing. But in Ukraine, they could marry, and hence what happened there is priesthood became hereditary because those guys started asking, why should, if I have a child, I can as well teach my priesthood thing to him, why should I then wait for some? So there is that also, right? So we should also talk about how hereditary priesthood also is not exclusive to Hinduism, except that it's un-Catholic, that's all. That's really what it is. That it is very different from how Christianity conducts priesthoods. Otherwise, as you said, there are so many pagan traditions where priesthood was hereditary. Even in Japan, you'll find it, China, you'll find it, all these tribal indigenous traditions, right? There are so many hereditary priesthoods. So it's somehow exclusively we are supposed to bear that guilt, while there are so many other traditions. Only reason for that guilt is it is just unchristian. That's all. That's what really it comes down to. I think that's again like a lot of work needs to be done there in terms of understanding pre-industrial cultures which are non-Abrahamic, like not Christian, not Islam, and forget about India. How was the rest of the world operating? If you start looking at it, you'll, as you said, there are just so many commonalities. And then you like worshipping nature, for example, right? That putting something to a tree and then tying to it turmeric and kumkum sort of thing, you'll pretty much find it in every other culture. It's only this whole post-Abrahamic thing where these things have become superstitious, but otherwise that was natural for almost practically every tradition.
So one last thing I want to say is, I think we are looking at it through analyzing it through the wrong framework. I think the way our ancestors looked at it, it was more of design.
Mhm.
And it was, the Purushartha was very important. So moksha was the ultimate goal for the entire civilization, for the entire society. So everybody needs to get to Rome. Everybody needs to get there. But everybody is in a different place.
Correct.
How do we build the roads? How do we build the highways so everybody can get there from wherever they are?
Mhm.
That was the problem.
Yeah.
Design problem.
Correct.
So then they said, okay, how do we optimize the resources, the society, so that everybody takes a role, so that ultimately we are all going in that direction,
Right.
right? So when outsiders come and their thinking was nobility versus commoners.
Mhm.
So commoners can go to hell, like, you know, if you don't have bread, eat cake, kind of thinking. But here it was, if somebody was doing Chandala work, it was not, at some point they chose that work,
Mhm.
that their ancestors, that group, they chose,
Yeah.
you know, somebody chose blacksmithing,
Correct.
somebody chose the stone work,
Right.
you know, somebody did, you know, we are good at this.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have a natural inclination, so there is the guna and karma and everything. So then optimally it was like, okay, that is why we could create this level of, so, you know, 10 million manuscripts still not translated.
Yeah.
You know, lakhs of temples.
Right.
In the same time period, if you, on a timeline, if you compare, India, what it produced over 5,000 years, and rest of the world, you'll see there's no comparison.
Yeah.
Only because we had this, we optimized. It was actually an optimization problem.
Right.
We came up with a great solution.
Correct.
and then we were the most productive.
Yeah.
But they came from a different angle. So this framework also needs to be looked at.
Yeah, I think it's totally like a different way of looking at things. And the moment I think you put individualism into the picture is where everything breaks. That I want to, it's that whole I thing comes, right? That's where I think everything breaks. But like what you said is what I was just reading also. I quoted Madhav Gadgil's book, right? So I'm just reading that autobiography of his. And he is also very focused on ecological aspects, and he focused a lot on how species grow and all of that. So he also makes this remark that he's also, he acknowledges his family background of Ambedkar, Pule, caste is bad, his own experiences that caste is a sin, I hate it, and my father hated it, all of those he says. But then since he's a scholar, he also respects this aspect that if you look at how nature operates and how each species has its own ecological niche, and everything grows as a succession, right? Maybe then caste is actually a replication of that, because when like that whole ancestral line, right? So it is like for an apple tree, a seed that again becomes an apple tree, one more seed becomes an apple tree, orange becomes an orange tree. So that's that's how the forest grew. That is what Professor Gadgil also says, that if you take a strictly ecological standpoint, that is perhaps the most natural way to model a society. And then, but he also says that maybe it's a social construct, not a religious construct, all of that. But in general, I think that is way how most of the pre-industrial societies operated. That's the most, if you have to look at nature and mimic human life, you will end up building something like that only, because a seed from an apple doesn't go to school and then figure out should I become orange or watermelon or something else, right? It's innate. And that's how nature is. So if you were to really play a god and model humans on the way nature is, right, you'll end up making something like this. And that is what, from a design standpoint, that's how things are. That design perhaps was common across so many pre-industrial societies. Now today, based on our contemporary standards, we consider it evil, and it's also impractical because of changing technology and all of that. But to what you said, at least we should be honest enough to acknowledge that all of this whole India was great, India's past was great, and we had such a rich culture, all of that. That culture stood on this hereditary tradition. So that much at least we should be like honest to acknowledge that there must have been something good in it, that it actually.
No, actually, it's you cannot escape it. You cannot escape the Varnas. And when I was in US, I said, okay, they're giving free education.
Yeah.
Anybody can go to good schools.
Right.
Everything is there. But then I see so many young people pushing carts at Walmart.
Yeah.
They have the choice.
Right.
But doesn't mean that you have the guna and the abilities. Right? Even in a family, if you take a joint family,
Right.
this would naturally work out like that. The most capable person would take more responsibility, would be more successful.
Yeah, like I think eventually things will settle down. It is just about whether each one of us has to individually figure out our Swadharma, or you can take a Swadharma from a lineage. But eventually, if you look at a very basic definition of Swadharma, it is about what should I do.
Right.
So people have to do something to survive day to day, right? So they'll get slaughtered over time anyway. That is anyway going to happen.
Even Bollywood actors, their children are going into.
It'll have, like, wherever I think those possibilities are there, the innate tendency is to pass on. So if you are a doctor, your wife is a doctor, and you have two kids, very high chances that one of them becomes a doctor, and there's enough research to prove that also, that so many traditions, things are still ancestral, because that influence you cannot just negate. And in fact, there is somebody, I think, who did this research of uh, elites of pre-French Revolution era, that royal bloodline and all, and they concluded that in most of the cases, the elites, like some 60-65% of the elites are from the same elites from that era, because there's all of this accumulated cultural capital, genetic capital, all of that, right? You cannot escape that. It's going to be that way. Just that today, what is happening is that everybody wants to go through this process, that I want to write an entrance exam, I want to try this, try that, whatever succeeds, I will succeed. But then, end of the day, somebody will become a delivery boy because there is no other job available in the market. And there was this analysis done the other day, right? Most of them were graduates. To become a delivery boy, do you really need graduate education? It's not the case, but that's how things are. And like last month, I guess in China, there was this whole thing going on millions are not getting jobs. Like every year, some 12 million students are coming out, they are not getting jobs. So officially, the government actually made a statement: why don't you consider farming? This real, I mean, you just type China farming, because this whole model of allocating livelihoods, there is no tried and tested model to this at all. We just know that if disrupting hereditary professions is what we did successfully, but how to allocate livelihood, secure livelihoods to everybody, nobody has a clue. And that is something so many development economists are also acknowledging today, that how can I make Africa rich as America? Give me a blueprint. Nobody has a clue. How can I make Bhutan rich? How can I make India rich? Nobody has a clue. So it's not like there is a tried and tested model that can be replicated. It's just more inefficient. I mean, everybody has to individually figure out what they should be, and eventually they'll get slaughtered. So ultimately, at a very macro level, there'll be some people doing intellectual work, some people are doing work for money, and some people doing like protecting the country from war and all that, and some people indulging in a lot of service economy. That's how world runs today also. Just that slotting is a bit of an inefficient process, and everybody at every point, every slot, they are trying to become something else. So if you are an auto driver, you cannot be content being an auto driver. You want to go to the next leg. So it is like this whole atomic structure, right? Everything should keep trying to go to the next level, and people above will come down. There's a lot of entropy basically.
I mean, that is hereditary is one thing, but if you take the Ayurveda, right? Today you can do a 2 year or 4 year degree, and then you can set up a shop. Say, I'm an Ayurveda expert, right? But our people, they wanted to look at the culture of excellence. You know, the greatest thing. To know everything there is to know, I need to start when I'm 10 months old. In my father's lap. Okay, I'm going to the forest in in this backpack. I'm learning to smell all the things, and I can distinguish between plants when I'm 5 years old. Right? It takes 20 years.
Correct.
And his guru has to say, now you can practice. Okay, it's not a paper degree.
Correct.
Or even Bharatanatyam or dance. The guru has to give permission. Now you can teach. Right? So because now you have put 20 years. So that thing is lost.
That's also lost, correct. And
you
that
cannot do it in 2 years.
that shows up in arts, no? That the kind of artists that we have today, there is nothing sacred about those arts anymore. No perfection, this thing, right? And that shows up there. So
Thank you so much.
In the interest of time, we will take one last question.
Since you have the mic, you can ask.
I just wanted to add on a lighter note that a weaver's son cannot become a weaver, but I said a Bollywood actor's son can become a Bollywood actor, and more than anything, a politician's son can definitely become a weaver.
and that politician who becomes a politician will comment on egalitarianism and say Sanatan Dharma should be eradicated. That's the funniest part. Correct. But if you look at what India is celebrating today, right? If you look at the gifts that like PM Modi goes to all these places, right? The gifts that he gives in these countries and all, he gives all these craft items, and the way those craft items are elevated is this is built by a blacksmith from Kolkata who is a 15th generation blacksmith. Yesterday they built this whole, they inaugurated that whole, yesterday, day before, right? That Nataraja statue. They are saying it is not any other statue, it is built by a 32nd generation sculptor from Tamil Nadu. So, for those matters, you are still valuing lineage, that it is not anybody and everybody, like to your point, it's not some college graduate sculptor. It is somebody who belongs to the 32nd generation of a sculptor family from Tamil Nadu, of this particular Stapati lineage. So, that is there. In those aspects, we are still valuing. Somewhere else it is demonized. As you said, maybe because there is no money in it. Or, yeah.
There was a special request for a question, so we'll give it to Maya. Any other questions? Maybe you can take it one-on-one with him after the session, but we will close.
So you told somewhere in between that the jivika of the children is what we have to probably think later. Education is fine. We as parents, we have put here because the foundation kind of finally will sow the seeds so that tomorrow they can look at Dharma takes them to. So what is your advice to us? In what ways we can improvise so that we can help them in that journey to also?
Yeah, the Jivika problem is what I couldn't solve for myself, so I cannot even speak for it. But I'm just saying that is the most difficult part of the problem, because it is everything else is at a stage where you are not earning money for yourself, right? Where you have to support yourself is where all the challenges come. But yeah, I think there are some basic things that we should at least value, that it's not all about money, it is not all about like don't leave the country. Some basic things you have to put as a like a ground rule, right? Like don't leave your parents. At least those things sound at a very Jivika level. We should at least ensure that families aren't broken, and people don't just like split and scatter, and you don't make too many wrong choices just to optimize for money, right? So, like, just to give an example again, because I'm reading that book, right, and it kind of is relevant. That let's say you are a paper mill merchant, right? So, Professor Gartkill talks about how paper industry came up in India, and that had an impact on bamboos as a resource. So, he went and asked this one of these paper mill people that you are just exploiting these bamboos forests mercilessly without any rule book. You are just indiscriminately using bamboo. What will you do tomorrow if you don't have bamboo? Then you cannot make paper. Then that fellow just says that I am not in it for the paper, I am in it for the money. Because if bamboo is done, I'll go to some other business. So that sort of an attitude from a Jivika standpoint is something we should condemn. That you cannot do indiscriminate things just to make a quick buck. So I think those are problems. So actually, what Professor Gadgil uses is he uses a harsh language. He says that pre-independence we used to call this colonialism, and this kind of violence used to happen. Post-independence we call it development, and the same violence happens. So that needs to be contested. So just because you need money for survival, you need not just indulge in this sort of indiscriminate activity.
Only exception is children having questions.
If I was of that age, I would have just gone by now. I am very surprised why they are staying here. Maybe that is where your Udhbhavaha education is working, maybe. Otherwise, I would have gone by now.
They
So,
have an assignment after this.
parents are sitting here.
yeah.
We just have the closing note, Divakar and
Since we're part of Udbhava also with Mayaka's question about Jivika, and to connect to what you were saying, apple should be apple and the neem have to be neem. So we should discover whether what seed that I am. And I'm sure Udbhava can be answerable place where I think there's recently one person who had come for weaving. So we were all interested into knowing, initially this revolutionary thought was there with us also when we began our journey, and we wanted to be a revolution in education and create change in the world where this change can replicate and do things that we are supposed to do. But over a period of time, there's some realizations and understanding that evolved, and when he met and he was trying to draw our attention to something. So, for example, we talk about all the kulavrittis and all these things, carpentry or weaver or pottery is so important. We have moved away from it. Why don't you start doing it? And farming as an example, there are a lot of agricultural universities. I'm sure there is no farmer coming out of it.
Correct. Yeah.
Maybe you can define them as agricultural scientists, even if you want to say that. So, but not definitely a farmer.
Yeah.
Likewise, like you said, about 32 generations of people when we're looking at the lineage, and that does play an important role in all of these aspects. So he was drawing their attention. If Udbhava's intention is to make your children weavers, I'm not interested. But to give an experience what they are, what does it take to?
Right.
Because we need to support those people who are continuing that lineage of weaving. Today, we have stopped being part of that ecosystem of such support. Like, we don't have to be everybody and everything. So this lead had whether to call it a hierarchy or difference, whatever that, but that had set a clear understanding what where I belong or where I would not. that really helped us. It's so important just to support that ecosystem is a role that we should play right now, standing here or sitting here. I think that's very important to look at it. The other element that I would carry today is about the impact, but you are talking about being maximum versus optimum. I think that's very important for us all to understand the source of the thought, the source where it is, the drishti in which we are approaching to things. Whether you do carpentry, whether you do whatever the jivika we are talking about, where is the source of that choice that coming from? What is that impact? I'm sure these two terms play an important role, and it is part. Maybe our ancestor might not have defined it in so optimum or a maximum kind of a thing, but the understanding was similar across the region, across languages, or across. I think that is Bharatiya is what I would resonate to. I'm sure that is been very beautifully brought up in this discourse of yours. And I mean, personally, thank you for traveling all the way and having this conversation with us and sharing your ability. And I thank you personally for all of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I don't usually do this, but because Deepa asked me right after the Take a Serene workshop, I thought I'll just come. But otherwise, I'm not into this mode of like talking to so many people, right? Because as you said, in my head, I know my Jivika itself is not answered. What is there for me to speak to so many people? But then, because I thought the topic needs some more attention, I just came all the way. Thank you.
It just works. So thank you so much. From children perspective, I think we were thinking that if they will understand or know, how is this going to be for children? So I think one of our, whether they understood or no, even if we've left them confused, I think a certain amount of purpose is met. Some questions at least have, the idea is some questions get sold. So I think probably we've met that. We just have a small token to give you.
Some more books for you.
Books I'll take, as many as you give, I'll take.
So this is Professor K.S. Narayanacharya.
Yeah, I saw some of those on that.
And Hiriyana, local writer here.
Achha, okay.
This is Narayanacharya. Visual Narayanacharya set of books.
Thank you.